Hello, everyone, and welcome back to X-Ranger. Before we begin, I thought it would be interesting if each of you could leave a comment indicating which part of the world you're joining us from. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe if you're enjoying the episodes. Now let's get comfortable, relax, and start our program. I still can't wrap my head around what happened that night back in 2008 in Maplewood, Illinois. To this day, when I think about it, I feel this tightness in my chest and a weird, hollow sensation in my stomach. Back then, I was just a college kid, and my friend Dwight and I decided to hit this local indie show at an old, abandoned theater. The place had been shut down for years, but I'd heard rumors that people were starting to hold underground shows there. It sounded like the kind of random summer thing we'd do. Cheap music, a weird venue, maybe a good story to tell later. I remember we walked there around sunset. The neighborhood felt off, like I'm not someone who believes in ghosts or anything, but the atmosphere just sucked the life out of the evening. There weren't many people on the streets, and the old streetlights flickered in a way that made everything look washed out and stale. I could smell that damp, old building smell before we even saw the marquee. When we reached the theater, the front doors were propped open with a chunk of concrete, and we could hear muffled music from inside, along with low voices that didn't match the small crowd we expected. It felt like people were lurking rather than attending a show. Inside, I noticed the place had definitely seen better days. The lobby looked like it had been left to rot since the 60s or 70s. There was peeling wallpaper, a dusty old chandelier that barely lit anything, and a ticket booth off to the side where a familiar face from high school, Liz, I think her name was, handed out these cheap wristbands. She gave us this weird grin, like she was letting us in on some private joke that we wouldn't understand until it was too late. I tried to brush it off as just the weird vibe of the night. The crowd was small and scattered, mostly people our age, some older, but all of them looked kind of uneasy. It was hot in there, humid as hell, and people were sweating even though it wasn't that warm outside. The main room had a makeshift stage with basic equipment. The band, some local indie group I'd never heard of, was tuning their instruments. The floor was covered in dust, and every step kicked it up, making the air taste stale and bitter. I kept wiping my eyes because I felt grit in them from all that dust. Dwight and I found a spot near the back, just leaning against a wall. The music finally started, and it was okay at first, just normal indie rock, echoing weirdly in that old, hollow space. But something felt off right from the start. I began noticing these small, unsettling details. The sound equipment started acting strange. Short bursts of static, high-pitched squeals that didn't match what the band was playing. A few people in the crowd kept looking around like they were expecting something else to happen, something not related to the music. Then Dwight nudged me hard and jerked his chin toward the far end of the room. I followed his gaze and saw this figure, someone tall, larger than anyone else around, standing in the shadows near the old emergency exit. I could barely see any details, just a silhouette, but it was huge, and it wasn't moving. Everyone else occasionally nodded their heads or shifted their weight, but this figure just stood there, completely still, eyes locked on the crowd, or at least it seemed that way. I couldn't see its face clearly, just a sort of outline. It looked bulky, like it was layered in heavy clothing or maybe covered in matted hair. It was hard to tell in that terrible lighting. The band played on, but the crowd got weirder. People started whispering to each other, and I overheard snippets like, "Who the hell is that?" and "Thought no one else was in here." The tension in the room kept building. At one point, I heard something crash, maybe a stack of plastic cups falling off a counter. Nobody had touched them. It was like the room itself was on edge, like even objects couldn't stay put. And as the band reached some kind of frantic crescendo, I noticed that several people were now staring at the figure in the corner. I tried to look away, to just focus on the music, but Dwight and I kept glancing back. I remember feeling this sweat trickle down my neck, not because it was hot, but because I was nervous as hell. Something about that figure made every instinct in my body scream that we shouldn't be there. It wasn't a normal guy. You know how sometimes you just know you're looking at something you can't explain? Like your brain tries to categorize it as a tall person, maybe in a coat, but something doesn't add up. Like the proportions are off. The arms too long, the shoulders too broad, the posture too strange. I started thinking about those random stories I'd read online late at night about people spotting large, hairy creatures, Bigfoot sightings, always somewhere more remote, deep in the woods. It sounded insane to think of something like that in a rundown theater in Maplewood, but I swear, the shape of that thing reminded me of those descriptions. It had that massive build, the weird outline of what looked like hair along its arms. And why would someone that big be standing there in complete silence, watching a random indie band, making everyone uncomfortable? As the music got louder, I noticed something else. The sound in that room was strange. There were weird echoes that didn't match the band's rhythm. It was like something was breathing heavy in the background, almost in sync with the beat. Not through the speakers. This was behind us, or maybe above us. I couldn't tell. I glanced at the ceiling, expecting to see something else lurking there, but it was just cracked plaster and dusty light fixtures. Then came the moment that really freaked me out. The figure, which had stood so still for so long, tilted its head slightly, and I caught a glimpse of reflection in its eyes. They seemed to catch the dim light and glint just for a moment. I felt a chill run up my arms. Around the same time, one of the band's speakers sputtered and died, leaving a strange silence on one side of the stage. The crowd started shifting around nervously, and I saw a girl not far from us with a look on her face that I can only describe as pure dread. She didn't say a word, just stared toward that shadowy corner as if she was looking at something that shouldn't exist. We decided we needed to leave. Dwight looked at me, and I could tell we were thinking the same thing. This wasn't just a crappy venue or a weird show. Something else was going on. Something that felt genuinely dangerous. We were here for a random indie gig, not to be part of some freak show with a creature or whatever it was. We started walking back toward the lobby, and I turned once more to see if the figure was still there. For a moment, I couldn't find it. My heart sank into my stomach. It was gone. Just gone. It hadn't moved while I was watching, but now it was nowhere to be seen. I pushed through a few people, some muttering under their breath, others just as spooked as we were. We got out into the lobby, and I saw Liz at the ticket booth again. She didn't even look at us, just stared down at the table, her weird smile replaced by a stiff expression like she'd seen something impossible. As we stepped outside, the air felt colder. This was midsummer, and it suddenly felt like late autumn. I could see our breath in that faint glow of the streetlights, and I swear to God, I heard this low, distant grunt, like an animal, echoing from somewhere behind the building. I didn't even want to turn around. Dwight didn't either. We just started walking, then jogging, then practically running back toward my car. We didn't speak much. What could we say? "Did you see that? What the hell was that thing?" Any words would have sounded stupid, because none of them would explain what we saw. After that night, we never went back to Maplewood. We told a few friends what happened, but they either laughed it off or just said we got freaked out by some weirdo. But I know what I felt. I know the kind of fear that hits you when you're facing something that isn't supposed to be real, something huge and silent and unsettling, something that makes electrical equipment fail and leaves everyone feeling watched. I still try to reason it out. Maybe it was a tall guy wearing a heavy coat, maybe some prankster in a costume. But that doesn't explain the feeling in the room, the sudden changes in temperature, the weird noises that didn't match the music, The way everyone got tense as if some predator was sizing us up. I'm not saying it was definitely Bigfoot, but it sure as hell wasn't normal. To this day, I can't listen to that kind of indie rock without feeling uneasy. I remember that figure, those reflective eyes, that strange silence after it vanished. We left that old theater expecting something else to happen. Sirens, screams, anything. But there was nothing. Just quiet streets and a memory that still makes my skin crawl. I have no idea what was in that place with us that night, and it still messes with my head. All these years later, I can't explain it, and I probably never will. It just happened, and then it stopped, leaving me with more questions than answers. Story 2. I still remember that day in mid-June of 2009 like it was yesterday. I was in the Mount Hood National Forest, not too far from Estacada, Oregon. I'd been going there for years, finding quiet spots along lesser-known trails where I could just breathe and think. It always felt so peaceful out there. That morning, I set off early, and everything seemed perfectly normal at first. The sun filtered through the canopy, the air was crisp, and a few other hikers passed by with friendly nods. The birds were doing their usual thing, singing away, and the whole place just felt alive. As I got deeper into the forest, though, I noticed something off. The usual background noise started to fade out. The bird song became less frequent, and the silence began to feel heavier, if that makes sense. I've been out there enough times to know how the atmosphere normally feels, and this was different. It was like the forest was holding its breath. At first, I thought maybe a larger predator was around, like a bear or even a cougar. Animals get quiet when something big moves in, right? Still, something about this felt wrong. The hair on the back of my neck stood up, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. A little while later, I crossed this small wooden footbridge over a creek. The water was running low, so I could hear just about everything around me. That's when I picked up on these dull thuds in the distance. They sounded like heavy footsteps snapping branches. I stopped and listened, but they faded. I tried to tell myself it was a deer or an elk, but I couldn't make it fit in my mind. The steps had a weight to them, a pattern that made me uneasy. I pushed on, trying to stay calm. Eventually, I came across tracks on a patch of soft earth, huge footprints, way bigger than anything I'd seen before. They were wide, deep, and the stride between them was enormous. I actually squatted down and measured them roughly with my hand. They were easily twice the width of my own boot, and I'm no small guy. I stood there staring at them, feeling more and more unsettled. That's when I ran into Tom Harrison. I've known him in passing. He's a local hunter who knows these woods like the back of his hand. He's usually pretty relaxed, the kind of guy who always has a friendly word to share. But this time, he looked rattled. He confessed that he'd been hearing stories from other locals about something strange roaming the area. People whispered about it being some kind of Bigfoot-like creature. Tom wasn't one to believe in tall tales, but he admitted something weird was going on. We both decided, somewhat hesitantly, to check out a set of strange markings we'd seen on the bark of some nearby trees. They looked like scratches, or maybe where something had stripped the bark clean. We also spotted tufts of dark, coarse hair tangled in some low branches. It wasn't bear fur. I've seen bear fur before. And it didn't look like deer or elk hair either. We followed these subtle signs further into the forest, both of us moving as quietly as possible, trying not to spook whatever might be out there. Eventually we stumbled upon this old, abandoned cabin I'd never noticed before. It was half hidden by ferns and moss. The roof sagged, and the door was hanging on one hinge. Inside was a mess, broken furniture, piles of old junk tossed around like someone had been searching for something without much care. But it wasn't the kind of destruction you'd expect from weather or just decades of neglect. It looked recent. Some of the wood inside had fresh scratches, and there was a weird smell lingering. It wasn't rotten like an animal carcass, and it wasn't the smell of mold. It was something musty and almost bitter, something I couldn't quite place. Tom and I stayed close together, listening for any sound. We didn't talk much, just low whispers to make sure we weren't imagining the same things. I remember my stomach knotting up. I've faced tough conditions outdoors. I've come close to dangerous animals before. But this just felt different. There was a kind of intelligence behind this mess. I can't say how I knew, but I felt like whatever did this wasn't just acting on instinct. It was like we were trespassing, and something wanted us to know it. Then, while we were still inside the cabin, we heard it. Something snapped a branch outside, not more than 20 or 30 feet away. The sound was sharp, deliberate. We both froze. I felt my heart hammering so hard I thought it'd give us away. Tom reached for his hunting knife. Not a gun, just a knife, which wasn't exactly comforting. We didn't say a word. We just looked at each other, wide-eyed, trying to decide what to do. We waited, hearing only our own breathing and the creak of the old cabin walls. After what felt like an eternity, we stepped out, keeping low and quiet. I wanted to bolt, to run right then, but I forced myself to move slowly, not to make noise. As we got a few steps away from the cabin, we heard this low, rumbling grunt. It was deep, resonant, and it vibrated through my chest like sub-bass at a concert. I've heard bears, moose, elk bugling, you name it. This sound was unlike any of those. It was almost like a warning. It made my blood run cold. We never actually saw the creature, and maybe that's what's been haunting me the most ever since. But that grunt, it had this strange, hollow quality that I can't get out of my head. Tom whispered under his breath that we needed to leave. Now. We picked our way carefully back toward more familiar trails, scanning the trees, expecting at any second to see something huge and hairy step into view. But the thing never showed itself. Instead, it felt like it was always just behind us, or just to the side, watching from the shadows. Eventually, the forest's normal sounds started returning. I heard a jay screech, and some distant squirrels chattering. With every familiar noise, I felt a tiny bit safer. We made it back to a more frequented part of the trail system, where we passed another hiker who must have wondered why we were pale and sweating. Neither of us said a word to him. We just moved on, eager to get back into town. In Estacada, we parted ways. Tom said he'd report what we saw, what we experienced, to whoever would listen. He had contacts. He knew some folks who study wildlife, maybe even some that looked into the Bigfoot legends. I just nodded, still rattled. What was I going to say? That I followed huge footprints into the woods and found some abandoned cabin, torn up by something unknown that we never actually saw. Ever since that day, I haven't been able to explain what happened. I've tried convincing myself it was a bear, a big one, or maybe some pranksters messing with us. But I know what I felt, what I heard. That sudden silence in the forest, the footprints, that strange fur, and that horrifying grunt. Those things don't line up with any normal explanation. I've gone back to those woods since, but never alone, and never without feeling that uneasy knot in my stomach. It's like the place changed for me. Before, it was my safe haven, a spot I knew inside and out. Now, it's a reminder that there are things out there I can't understand. Whatever it was, it let us know it was there, and then just vanished. To this day, I can't make sense of it, and I'm not sure I ever will. Story 3. It happened back in October 2010, during a work trip to a small town in Maine. I remember it was one of those chilly afternoons where the cold seems to come not just from the temperature, but from the quiet stillness in the air. I had spent the morning in dull meetings and going over contracts, and by late afternoon I really needed some fresh air. The hotel staff had mentioned a nearby trail that few tourists ever took, a path through the woods that supposedly led to a small clearing with a good view of the surrounding hills. I felt drawn to it, maybe just craving the simple sound of leaves under my feet and the smell of damp earth. I set out wearing a light jacket, thinking it would be a short walk. The forest entrance wasn't well marked, and I recall having to push aside some branches to find the trail. There was something oddly peaceful at first, the scent of fallen leaves, the way the wind gently rattled the branches above. But as I moved deeper, that peace started to feel strained. The light was fading faster than I expected. The sun hadn't fully set yet, but the sky was shifting to a darker shade of grey, and the trees seemed to lean in closer, as if blocking out the last bits of daylight. Then I spotted something that made me pause, a set of footprints on a patch of soft ground. They were huge, larger than any human print I'd ever seen, not just big feet, but gigantic broad impressions that sunk deep into the soil. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was just some odd shape left by overlapping boot prints, or maybe a bear's hind paws, though I'd never seen bear tracks shaped quite like that. I found myself getting nervous. The forest suddenly felt too quiet. The birds that were chirping when I entered seemed to have vanished. It's unsettling how silence can wrap around you in a place like that, making each of your own footsteps sound way too loud. I continued, more cautiously now. The wind picked up a bit, and I heard something like a low growl or grunt in the distance. It wasn't a normal forest sound, nothing like the rustling of a deer or the bark of a fox. It was deeper, more resonant, as if something large and heavy was shifting behind the trees. I tried to calm myself, telling myself it was probably just my imagination. I pushed forward, but my heart was beating faster. Every step I took, I felt this growing tension in the pit of my stomach. Then I saw her, a woman, older, wearing a thick coat and a hat that looked worn by time. She was standing a bit off the trail, staring at me, her posture rigid. I hadn't expected to see anyone out there. She didn't come closer. She just raised her voice slightly, enough that I could hear, "You shouldn't be out here after dark." That's all she said. Before I could ask what she meant, she turned and slipped back into the underbrush. I hurried to follow her, or at least get another glimpse, but by the time I reached where she had been, she was gone. It was like she had vanished. The only thing I heard then was a single dry branch cracking under some unseen weight far off in the gloom. I should have turned back right there. Something was off, and my instincts knew it. But I was stubborn. I thought maybe it was just a local trying to spook an outsider, or I was overreacting. I kept walking, though more slowly now. The temperature seemed to drop with every minute, and I could feel the sweat cooling on my back. My heart fluttered at the slightest sound, twigs snapping, leaves rustling. The daylight was almost gone, the woods becoming a patchwork of dark shapes. I tried to pick out the path, but it kept twisting in ways I didn't remember. That's when I noticed the feeling of being watched. It's hard to describe, but you know when someone's eyes are on you. The hair on my neck stood up. I stopped and listened, holding my breath. I caught a glimpse of something huge moving between the trees, just a silhouette, a massive figure covered in what looked like thick, dark hair. It was there for a split second, then gone. I froze. This was no bear standing on hind legs. It was taller, broader, and the shape of its limbs was disturbingly human-like, though far more bulky. I swallowed hard, suddenly aware that I was alone and unarmed in unfamiliar woods, possibly facing something that shouldn't exist. I felt this crushing wave of terror. My body wanted to run, but I was afraid that would trigger it to chase me. My mouth went dry. As the last light faded, I panicked and stumbled forward, hoping to find any hint of human presence, maybe a cabin or a house. Luck or fate led me to a small cabin with a dim glow in the window. It looked old and rough, but I didn't care. I rushed to the door and knocked, half expecting no answer. Instead, a man's voice asked who I was and what I was doing there. I just muttered something desperate like, "Please, let me in, someone's out there." The door opened, and a man, maybe in his 40s, introduced himself as Jeff. He looked as startled as I felt, but he let me inside without hesitation. I told him what I'd seen. I tried to stay calm, but I must have sounded hysterical. Jeff listened quietly, then nodded. He said he'd heard stories over the years of something roaming these woods, something people compared to those Bigfoot legends. He'd never seen it himself, but he had encountered strange things now and then. We barely had time to talk, because a heavy thump sounded against the cabin wall. Something was outside, circling around. Then came a scraping noise against the wood, like claws dragging along the side. Jeff grabbed an old rifle he kept in the corner and told me to stay back. I stood there holding a thick piece of firewood, my heart hammering in my chest. I could feel the vibration of something huge walking around outside. It was close. I could hear its breathing, a heavy rhythmic sound. We both just stood there, silent, muscles tensed. Then, out of nowhere, Jeff fired a warning shot straight through an open upper window, into the air. The blast echoed through the trees. For a moment, everything went quiet. We waited, ears ringing. I was sweating, shaking, barely able to keep my grip on that piece of wood. It's hard to explain how intense those moments felt. Every second stretched out, and the cabin's old floorboards creaked under my shifting weight. The silence outside was terrifying. We didn't know if it had left, or if it was standing right behind the wall, waiting for us to let our guard down. Eventually, we heard faint steps, heavy, but fading away. We waited longer, maybe 10 or 15 minutes, not moving, not speaking. The tension was suffocating. Finally, Jeff motioned for me to stay put while he carefully edged open the door, just a crack. Nothing. The darkness outside was complete, but the thing seemed to be gone. After another long pause, we both stepped out. The night air was cold against my sweat-soaked clothes. There was no sign of anything unusual, no figure, no growls, just the distant sound of wind in the trees. We wasted no time. Jeff had his truck parked a little ways down a rough track. He insisted we leave right then, no matter how dark it was. I was happy to follow. We hurried, constantly looking back, expecting something to lunge at us. The forest, though, remained still, almost indifferent to what had just happened. When we finally got into his truck and headed back toward the town, I felt my pulse start to slow, but the fear stayed with me. I think Jeff was shaken too. He didn't say much, just kept glancing at me, probably checking if I was all right. We reached the main road, and streetlights never looked so comforting. Back in the safety of civilization, the whole thing felt unreal, like a nightmare I might have dreamed up. But I knew it was real. My muddy clothes, the lingering smell of damp wood and pine needles on my jacket, the tension still stiff in my shoulders. These were all reminders that I hadn't imagined it. We parted ways near the local diner. He just told me to be careful and nodded, his face serious. I tried to talk about what we'd seen, but he kept it short. He said people have whispered about something in those woods for decades, and maybe it's better not to stir up too many questions. I could see in his eyes that he'd be thinking about it for a long time, just like I would. The next morning I had to continue my work trip, and I tried to carry on as if nothing had happened. But even now, so many years later, I still can't fully explain what I saw or what was out there. I've read about Bigfoot sightings, about strange encounters in remote forests, and I guess that's the closest explanation I have. I know what I experienced wasn't just a trick of the light or my imagination running wild. That footprint, that huge shape moving between the trees, the sounds and that awful feeling of being watched, it all left me with a kind of uneasy respect for what might be lurking out there, beyond the edges of what we think we know. I never went back to that spot. There's a part of me that never wants to step foot in that forest again. It was one awful, surreal day that still gives me chills when I think about it. The memory hasn't faded much, and I don't think it ever will. I'm not saying I know what's out there, but I am sure that whatever it wasn't a normal animal. I survived that night without any physical harm, but the feeling of vulnerability and fear I experienced will probably stay with me forever. Some things just don't fit neatly into our understanding, and I guess that's something I have to live with. Story 4. I remember that day in 2011 like it just happened. It was supposed to be a calm afternoon. My friend Fitzroy and I had driven out to the edge of Bluffton near Lake Fusa, looking for a quiet spot to unwind. There was an old wooden bench by the shore, half hidden among low bushes and a few scattered trees. We'd brought a deck of cards, something we did sometimes to escape the usual noise of town. The lake always seemed peaceful, the kind of place that makes you forget about everything else, even if it's only for a few hours. The sun was out, no clouds, a soft breeze coming off the water. We sat there, shuffling cards, talking about nothing special, just old memories and the way things were simpler when we were kids. The surface of the lake was so still that the reflection of the sky looked almost painted on. A couple of ducks had swum by earlier, and every now and then you'd hear birds calling. It felt like nature was doing all it could to make this day flawless, to give us one of those afternoons you look back on and smile about. But after a while, I noticed something odd. The birds fell quiet, as if someone had turned off their sound completely. Even the breeze seemed to slow down. I remember lifting my head and just sensing this heavy silence. It wasn't something I could see, but I felt it. Fitzroy caught on too. We stopped playing cards for a moment and looked around. Nothing seemed obviously wrong at first. No sudden movement in the bushes, no strange noise. Just silence. Then I saw it. Right near the tree line, across from where we sat, something moved. The trees grew thick there, their trunks and the undergrowth forming a kind of green wall. Between the branches, I caught a glimpse of something big and dark. It wasn't a shape I recognized. I remember thinking it could be a bear, even though bears weren't common around that area. But this shape stood more upright, not hunched like a bear. It looked tall, really tall, and it seemed to be covered in dark, rough hair. At least, that's how it looked to me. I tried to keep my breathing steady, but my heart was already racing. The silence felt heavier with every second. Fitzroy tried to brush it off at first, suggesting maybe it was just a big animal passing through, but I could see the concern in his eyes. We both stood up slowly, not knowing whether to run or stay put. That's when I heard this low, guttural sound. It didn't sound like anything I'd heard before, more like a deep, strained grunt that rumbled through my chest. When the creature stepped partially out of the shadows, I got a better look at it. It was massive, towering over the brush. Its arms were long, and I could see powerful muscles beneath the hair. Its eyes seemed to reflect a bit of the afternoon light, watching us with an intense, focused stare. I felt this immediate jolt of fear, a kind of primal panic I'd never experienced. I remember feeling exposed, like we were trespassers on someone else's land. We tried to back away slowly, not to provoke it. I couldn't think straight. I just wanted to put distance between us and that thing. But the terrain wasn't great for running. We were too close to the lake, and on the other side there was thick vegetation. Then I saw a low tree branch within reach. Fitzroy and I looked at each other, and without saying a word, we decided to climb. It felt ridiculous, like we were trapped animals looking for any kind of safety. But up in that tree, maybe we'd have a better chance. We weren't prepared for something like this. Who would be? Clinging to those branches, I felt every scrape of the bark against my palms. My heart pounded so loudly I was sure the creature could hear it. From that vantage point, I could see it more clearly. It paced, circling around, almost like it was trying to understand what we were. I remember the sound of its heavy steps, the way the forest floor seemed to crack and rustle beneath its weight. There was a strange odor, too, earthy and pungent, like damp fur mixed with old leaves. It filled my nose, made it hard to think. I tried to stay perfectly still, even though my legs were shaking. Fitzroy was just above me, gripping a branch so tightly his knuckles turned white. The creature looked up a few times, and I swear it locked eyes with me. I felt this wave of fear, my throat so tight I could hardly breathe. I was sure it could pull us down if it wanted to. The tree we had chosen wasn't that tall or sturdy. If it decided to come closer, we had nowhere else to go. Time seemed distorted. It felt like we were trapped there for hours, though it was probably just minutes. The creature never came right under the tree, but it kept close, moving around, making these low breathing sounds and occasional grunts. I could see its chest rise and fall, see how massive its shoulders were. I noticed that the forest around it looked quieter than ever, as if every living thing had fled or gone silent. Then, unexpectedly, it began to move away. It didn't run off or show any sign of fear. It just drifted back into the thicker part of the woods. I watched until I couldn't see its silhouette anymore. Even then, I didn't dare move. Fitzroy and I stayed in that tree for a long time, waiting for something, anything, a hint that it had truly left. My limbs started to ache from clinging to that branch, and sweat dripped down my neck, making me shiver. When we finally climbed down, I felt weak in the knees. The forest still had that uneasy quiet. I remember looking at the ground, seeing footprints in the soft soil, huge impressions that made no sense to me. We didn't linger. We just walked as quietly as possible, away from the lake, away from that spot. Every few steps I'd turn around, expecting to see those dark eyes watching us again. Eventually, we reached a more familiar trail. Once we felt safe enough, we rushed back to the outskirts of Bluffton. We tried telling a couple of people what happened, but no one believed us. They shook their heads, said we must have seen a bear or maybe let our imaginations get the best of us. I couldn't blame them. Even while telling it, I felt how crazy it sounded. But I know what I saw. Fitzroy knows too. We didn't imagine it. That day changed something in me. I'd always loved being outdoors, feeling like nature was calm and predictable in its own way. But now I know there are things out there that don't fit neatly into what we think we know. I can still feel that stare sometimes when I close my eyes, the weight of silence pressing down like a warning. Nothing else ever came of it. We never saw it again, and I never went back to that specific spot by the lake. It's strange how it all ended so suddenly, like it never even happened, just a quiet return to normal life. But I can't erase it from my memory. That image of something large and unknown, watching us in silence, is still burned into my mind. I don't have any explanations. I don't know what it was or where it came from. All I know is that for those moments, I felt something I never thought I'd feel in a place I once considered so peaceful, pure, unmistakable fear. Story 5. I remember that day so vividly, even though it's been years. It was back in 2012, when I was living in Quivy, a small town in Vermont that most people have never even heard of. I'd moved there for some peace and quiet, and I sure got the quiet part, until that particular day when everything turned upside down. It all started early in the morning when I found a package on my porch. There was no return address, no note, nothing. Just this old wooden box, maybe about a foot long, with strange carvings I'd never seen before. The wood felt rough under my fingertips, and it had a weird smell, like old books and damp earth. Inside the box was this complicated wooden puzzle, each piece carved with tiny patterns that didn't immediately make sense. I've always been the kind of person who loves old curiosities, and this definitely seemed like one of those rare, handcrafted antiques, I figured maybe someone from town knew I was into old stuff and thought this would be a nice gift. It didn't occur to me then how strange it was that no one took credit. I spent the morning trying to piece it together. The puzzle looked ancient, with tiny joints and hinges that had to be aligned just right. I kept at it, leaning over my kitchen table, squinting at the carvings. Hours passed, and I barely noticed. I was so focused that I didn't realize how quiet everything had gotten outside. It's usually peaceful in Quivy, but this was a different kind of silence. It felt weighted. As I clicked a piece into place around midday, I heard something outside, like heavy footsteps. Not someone jogging or walking their dog. These were heavier, slower, almost deliberate thuds on the ground. I remember stopping, holding my breath, listening. I wanted to believe it was just my neighbor carrying something large in his backyard, or maybe a deer moving through the brush. Still, something felt off. In the afternoon, I got curious about the puzzle's origin. I had an idea where I might find a clue. The local bookstore, run by this old guy who knew a lot about regional history and folklore. I took a break and went into town. While flipping through some old books, I stumbled onto a weird set of references, stories about strange creatures drawn to certain artifacts or rituals. The old folklore mentioned large, hairy beings lurking in forests. I didn't say much to the bookseller, just paid for a couple of old clippings he let me have and headed back home. By the time I got back, the atmosphere around my house felt different. The day was getting cloudy, early evening was setting in, and I had this feeling like something was watching me. I know that sounds dramatic, but I swear, it felt like a pair of eyes following my every movement. I decided to keep working on the puzzle in my kitchen. I wanted to see if maybe finishing it would reveal some secret, some hidden compartment or a pattern that matched what I found in the old clippings. But each time I added another piece, I'd hear a noise outside, a branch snapping, a low rustling in the brush, something that sounded like a grunt or a huff. It got more frequent, as if whatever was out there knew I was getting closer to completing the puzzle and didn't like it. Eventually, I grabbed a flashlight and stepped out onto my porch. The air was heavier than usual, like it was about to storm. But it wasn't just the humidity, it felt charged. I scanned around with the beam of my flashlight, moving slowly, not wanting to scare off whatever animal was lurking. That's when I saw huge footprints in the dirt near my veranda steps. I'm not talking about a bear or a large man. These were different. They were wide and long, and the depth of the imprint suggested something incredibly heavy. I knelt down to look closer and felt this cold wave of fear wash over me. The prints were fresh, definitely not there in the morning. I got nervous and went back inside, locking my door. My heart was pounding. My mind kept going back to those old stories I'd read in the bookstore, and the idea of something big, hairy, and almost human-like roaming the forests. It's not like I truly believed in Bigfoot or whatever people call it, but at that moment, it seemed possible. I mean, I was alone, and something clearly large was just outside my house. Stupidly, I decided to force some kind of conclusion to this. I picked up the puzzle again, determined to see if the nearly completed image would give me any clue. By now, most of the puzzle showed these old carvings of ape-like figures in a forest setting. It looked like it was telling a story, some kind of ancient encounter, maybe a warning. The last few pieces were tricky to fit, and every time I fumbled with them I could hear something outside, the creaking of the old cedar tree near the edge of my yard, heavy breathing, maybe even a faint, low growl. My curiosity got the better of my fear. I wanted proof. I took my flashlight and decided to head into the trees, at least a little bit, to see if I could catch a glimpse of whatever was out there. I stepped off my porch and moved slowly into the tree line. The smell of damp leaves and pine needles was strong, and the ground was uneven under my boots. The silence was intense. No crickets, no birds, nothing. Just my breathing and the crunch of twigs beneath my feet. After maybe 20 yards in, I saw movement. I froze, shining my flashlight toward the motion. For a brief second, I caught sight of something tall and massive, its shape partly hidden behind the trunk of a large pine. Dark, matted hair covered its body. It was at least 7 feet tall, maybe taller, and its eyes, God, I'll never forget how they reflected the flashlight beam. It was like a dull amber glow, full of caution and something else. Curiosity, anger, I can't say for sure. Before I could react, it stepped backward, almost silently, and vanished deeper into the woods. I stood there, shaking, not sure if I should chase it or run back inside. I ended up stumbling back toward my house, nearly tripping over a root. When I got back inside, I locked the door again, turned off all the lights, and peered out through the window. I didn't see it anymore, but I felt it out there, watching. I felt this intense pressure, like I'd crossed some line I shouldn't have. That puzzle on my table, those carved images, they suddenly felt dangerous. I didn't want to finish it anymore. Whatever connection existed between that object and the creature, it was real. Maybe finishing it would have sealed some kind of invitation or opened a door I had no business opening. I placed the puzzle pieces back into their old wooden box, closing it carefully. I shoved it into the back of a closet I rarely used, behind old jackets and boxes of junk. Immediately after doing that, the oppressive feeling eased a little. I sat down on my couch, my heart still racing, sweat on my forehead. I tried to listen outside, but all I could hear now was the wind picking up, rustling the leaves, sounding normal again. Over the next hour or so, things just settled. I half expected the creature to try breaking into my house or slamming against the walls, but nothing happened. No more footsteps, no more strange grunts. It was like, by putting the puzzle away, by refusing to finish it, I'd ended whatever was going on. The silence gradually returned to the usual peaceful calm of Quivy. By late evening, I felt like I could breathe again. I never saw that creature again after that night. The footprints faded by the next morning, and no one in town ever mentioned seeing anything strange. I never brought it up. I still have that puzzle, tucked away in the back of my closet. I've never taken it out again. Part of me wants to forget the whole thing, to chalk it up to stress or some weird coincidence. But every time I think about it, I remember the weight of those footsteps, the odd carvings, and that brief glimpse of something not supposed to exist. It still gives me chills. It's been years now, and I have no explanation. The puzzle remains incomplete, and honestly, I think it's better that way. I can't explain what happened that day, or what I saw out there in the woods. Maybe I stumbled onto something old and secret, something that shouldn't be disturbed. Since then, I've learned that some mysteries don't need solving. Sometimes leaving the last piece out is all you can do to keep things as they are. That's what I've done, and I've never tried to finish that puzzle again. Story 6. I remember it was late summer in 2013, right after I got off work. Back then, I lived in Mariah, Maine, a small place where most of us knew each other, and nobody expected anything strange to happen. It was a quiet evening, and I was walking down the same route I took every day, a back alley shortcut that led toward the small grocery store before heading home. I was thinking about what to make for dinner, maybe some canned soup or leftover stew, something simple. I was tired and just wanted to settle down for the night. As I turned the corner, I saw a man leaning against the brick wall of the old hardware store, partially hidden in the dim light of the alley's lone bulb. He looked exhausted, worn out, like he'd been walking for hours. He had a thin jacket tied around his waist, and his boots looked caked with mud and pine needles, like he'd been out in the woods for quite some time. He called himself Hank, introduced himself in a quiet, strained voice when I asked if he was all right. I'll admit, I was a bit wary at first. Strangers in an alley aren't a common sight in Mariah, and people here are usually friendly but cautious. Still, something in his eyes made me feel he wasn't looking for trouble. He looked desperate, not dangerous, and clearly not well. I asked if he needed help, and he just nodded slowly, like every movement took effort. I offered him a warm meal and a place to rest for the night. In a town like Mariah, it wasn't unusual to help someone out if they looked like they'd hit a rough patch. I just felt it was the right thing to do. He hardly said anything as we walked back to my place, which was a small one-story home on a quiet street near a patch of woods. I remember feeling a bit nervous bringing a stranger under my roof, but I couldn't just leave him there. He looked like he hadn't slept or eaten properly in days. Once inside, I fixed him something warm, some leftover chicken and potatoes, heated on the stovetop. He ate quietly but gratefully, eyes darting occasionally toward the back window. It was strange, the way he seemed hyper-aware of everything. After he finished, I got him a blanket and suggested he stay on the couch. I thought he'd probably just pass out, but he seemed restless, like he had something heavy on his mind. Eventually he began talking. He spoke in a low voice, almost a whisper. He told me he'd been staying in a small cabin deep in the woods outside Mariah. He didn't say for how long or why he was out there, but it sounded like he preferred isolation. Then he mentioned odd things that started happening around his place. He found enormous footprints around the cabin, far larger than any humans. He'd heard strange, deep grunts and breathing near his porch at night. Branches snapping at odd hours, leaves rustling, as if something big was pacing back and forth. He said he always felt watched, especially after sundown. I remember thinking maybe it was a bear, but he insisted it was something else, something upright, something that seemed to understand that he was there too. He said he knew it sounded ridiculous, but he believed it was a Bigfoot. At that, I'll be honest, I was skeptical. A lot of folks pass through Maine's woods, and occasionally you get tall tales. But Hank wasn't smirking or playing a prank. He was serious, nervous, and his voice shook when he talked about it. His eyes had this haunted look, like he'd seen something no one would believe. I tried to keep my expression neutral, but inside I was thinking, either this man is really unwell, or he's just had the scare of his life. While we were talking, more like him talking and me occasionally nodding, I heard something outside. It was subtle at first, just a gentle crack, like a stick breaking underfoot. I froze and held up my hand for silence. Hank stopped talking immediately. We both listened. Another crack, closer this time. Then a low, heavy sound, like a faint thud. My house has old windows, and they don't seal out the sound too well. I could almost feel the movement outside, something pacing through my yard. Hank started breathing faster, and he reached out to touch my arm lightly, just to let me know he heard it too. We turned off the lights, not wanting to draw attention. I approached the window slowly, careful not to make a sound. I could barely see anything at first. It was a clear night, moonlight faintly illuminating my small backyard, where I keep a few chairs and a fire pit. Suddenly, I saw a shape step into view. A large, dark silhouette on two legs, taller than any person I've ever seen. The shoulders were broad, and even though I couldn't see details, I could tell it was covered in something like fur. My heart was pounding so loud I could hear it in my ears. I didn't believe in Bigfoot. I didn't believe in any of that nonsense. But what I was looking at didn't fit any animal I knew. Hank touched my shoulder again and mouthed silently, "Don't make a sound." I just nodded, barely breathing. The creature took slow steps around the perimeter of the yard, as if inspecting. It didn't rush or charge. It just moved with a heavy, deliberate pace. Occasionally I could hear it sniffing or making these low grunts that made my skin crawl. It was close enough that I could see its outline clearly against the moonlight. I remember feeling an intense wave of dread, not the kind that makes you want to run, but the kind that forces you to freeze, hoping it will pass. At one point, I thought it might have caught my scent or seen a flicker of movement through the window. It stopped and tilted its head slightly. I couldn't see eyes, but I could feel its gaze. My lungs felt tight. I didn't dare to turn and look at Hank. I just focused on staying perfectly still. There was something incredibly unsettling about how calm and methodical it seemed. It didn't roar or smash at the door. It just walked around, circled my house like it was studying us. We stayed there in the dark for what felt like an eternity. In reality, maybe just a handful of minutes. My legs were shaking, my throat dry, and I kept thinking about how easily it could break a window if it wanted to. Any small noise, any movement might provoke it. The creature moved around the back, then along the side of the house. I lost sight of it for a moment and listened closely. Heavy footfalls, a low grunt, something brushing against the fence. My mind raced. Bears can stand on two legs momentarily, but they don't just walk around upright like that. And no human reaches that height or moves that silently between steps. Hank's breathing was shallow. I could hear it despite the tension. I felt a drop of sweat run down my neck. We stayed hunched by the window, lights off, every sense on high alert. Eventually, the sounds grew distant. Another branch snapped, but this time it sounded farther away. I waited, counting seconds in my head, wondering if it was still out there, just beyond my field of vision. I forced myself to stand up straighter and inch toward another window, looking out toward the front yard. The moonlight was weaker in front, where a few trees blocked it. I saw nothing, heard nothing. Maybe it left. Maybe it was never truly after us. Maybe it was curious. Or maybe it followed Hank and was now moving on. I had no way to know. We didn't speak for several minutes, just remained frozen, making sure it was gone. Eventually, I felt I could breathe again. We didn't dare turn the lights back on that night. We just sat there, waiting until it felt safe enough to move. My head was spinning. I couldn't wrap my mind around what I'd just witnessed. I wanted to believe it was some strange trick of the light, maybe a tall stranger in a costume, but the way it moved, it felt too real, too natural. The sense of presence and weight was unlike anything I've ever encountered. I didn't sleep much. Neither did Hank. In the morning, when the first light broke through my curtains, I finally felt secure enough to step outside. Hank was right beside me, cautious but determined. We walked around to the backyard, and sure enough, we found footprints, large, deep impressions in the soft soil near the fence line. They were definitely not made by boots. They looked like massive, bare footprints with distinct toes, larger and wider than any human foot. I tried to keep calm, but a shiver ran through me. There was also a peculiar smell lingering in the air, something musky and earthy, not something I can easily describe. It wasn't overwhelming, just odd. I remember crouching down to study those prints, trying to make sense of their shape. Hank stayed a step behind me, arms crossed, quietly staring. He looked calmer, like something had been confirmed for him, even if it terrified him. For me, it felt like my understanding of the world had just cracked. I'm not someone who believes in cryptids or legends. I've always been practical, grounded. But I couldn't deny what I'd seen and what now lay right in front of me, pressed into the ground. Hank thanked me later that morning. He said he needed to keep moving, that he wouldn't stay in the area any longer. I understood. I asked him where he'd go, but he just shrugged and said he'd figure something out on the road. He seemed more at peace, though still shaken. I didn't ask too many questions. I just gave him a couple of sandwiches and a bottle of water, and he nodded gratefully. After he left, I took a long time to consider what had happened. I cleaned up the dishes, tried to go about my day as if it were normal. But nothing felt normal. I never reported it. Who would I tell? The local police chief would probably just shake his head and laugh, or worse, think I was losing my mind. I considered telling a friend once, but I couldn't find the right words. It's not exactly easy to explain that I might have had a Bigfoot in my yard without sounding like a complete fool, so I kept it to myself. To this day, I haven't seen anything like it again. The woods around Mariah are quiet and peaceful most nights. Once in a while, I remember that heavy silence in my house, the shape shifting in the moonlight, those footprints in the morning, and I get that weird tightness in my chest again. I don't have an explanation. I've heard rumors from hunters and outdoorsmen. They sometimes mention strange noises or glimpses of large shapes in the forest, but nobody talks about it openly. It stays as a kind of whispered local lore. I guess I just wanted to share this, because even after all these years, I can't fully shake the feeling I got that night. There was something out there, something too large and too deliberate to dismiss. It wasn't some magical creature that vanished in a puff of smoke. It was flesh and blood. It was there, right in my backyard, testing my courage and reminding me that we don't know everything that lurks in the darkness beyond our windows. And just like that, as abruptly as it arrived, it left. No scratches on the walls, no broken windows, no direct confrontation. Just heavy footprints and the lingering sense that I was part of something I can't quite explain. After that night, I never saw Hank again. Sometimes I wonder if he ever found peace, or if he still wanders through quiet towns, warning people who probably won't believe him. As for me, I keep my eyes open a bit wider when I step outside after dark, and I'll never look at those woods the same way again. Story 7. I remember that night in such clear detail, it's still hard for me to wrap my head around how ordinary it started and how messed up it ended. It was 2014. I was working as a clerk in this tiny convenience store in Barton, Pennsylvania. The store was nothing special. Cheap fluorescent lights, stale coffee, the scent of old magazines mixed with cigarette smoke. I'd just finished my usual night shift. I was tired, but my head was buzzing, and I didn't feel like going straight home. The sky was clear, and I knew there was this barely known trail not too far away. I thought a short walk under the stars would calm my mind before I hit the sack. Barton's a small place, surrounded by gentle hills and old woods. Most folks stick to the main paths if they go out at night, but I'd heard rumors about a smaller trail off one of the back roads that led to a quiet clearing. I parked my car a bit off the main route, grabbed my jacket, and started walking with just my phone's flashlight to guide me. At first, everything felt normal. The ground was a bit damp. The scent of wet leaves and earth was kind of comforting, and the only sound was the chirping of crickets. It was actually nice, peaceful, you know. I remember thinking, this is what I needed, just a moment away from people and noise. I'd been walking maybe 10 minutes when I noticed something strange. The crickets. They just stopped. It's eerie when a forest goes quiet like that. I've heard silence in the woods before, but this felt different. It wasn't the gentle hush before dawn or something like that. It was tense, like something was off. The kind of silence that makes the back of your neck tingle. I tried to shrug it off, telling myself maybe there was a fox nearby or some predator that scared the insects into shutting up. Still, my gut was tight. I kept moving slowly, careful with each step because the trail wasn't clear. The ground felt softer under my feet, almost muddy in places, and that's when I spotted them, these massive footprints in the dirt. They were large, bigger than any human foot I'd ever seen, and definitely not shaped like a bear's paw. They had that elongated shape, kind of like a huge human footprint but wider, deeper. Each impression was so clear that I could count the toes, 5 of them, if I recall correctly. I'm not some animal expert, but I know what bear tracks look like, and these weren't bear tracks. My heart started thumping harder. I aimed my phone's flashlight around, trying to see if there were more tracks. There were. They formed a sort of line, heading deeper into the woods. I followed them for a few steps, and then I heard hushed voices. For a second, I thought maybe it was just my mind playing tricks, but then I moved a bit closer and realized there were people crouching behind a fallen trunk. I nearly jumped out of my skin when I saw them. 3 people, maybe hikers. They looked terrified. One of them spotted me and waved urgently, motioning for me to stay quiet. I approached slowly, my heart racing, and I could see the fear in their faces. They weren't talking loudly, just whispering, stammering, pointing into the darkness. I caught a few words, something about seeing a huge creature covered in hair. They didn't have any proof. They looked like they were just as freaked out as I was, if not more. We were all on edge, trying to make sense of it. None of us dared to really speak above a whisper. I remember one of them, a woman maybe in her 30s, looked like she had been crying. Another guy kept gripping a flashlight but refused to shine it anywhere but at his feet. They were huddled together, clearly shaken by something. I didn't ask too many questions. I could feel the tension, and I knew raising my voice or fumbling around with my phone could set something off. We decided, with just a few nods and hand gestures, to head back towards the main trail. Strength in numbers, I guess. I was nervous as hell. Every step felt like a gamble. The air was so still that even the slightest crack of a branch under my foot sounded like a gunshot to me. I kept scanning the shadows, half expecting some huge shape to step into the faint glow of our combined phone lights. And then we heard it. This deep, low, rumbling sound that I can't fully describe. It wasn't a growl like a dog's or a bear's roar. It was deeper and more resonant, like something huge clearing its throat right behind the curtain of darkness. My blood turned cold. I could feel the others freeze. We didn't see it clearly at first. It was just this massive shape partially hidden behind trees. But we knew it was there. It was tall, taller than any human. When it moved, the branches swayed a bit, and I could make out a thick form covered in dark, matted hair. It kept its distance, maybe 20 or 30 feet away, but the presence of this thing was overwhelming. We didn't run. I think running would have been the worst idea. Instead, we moved slowly, step by careful step, trying not to make noise. I remember feeling my heart hammering so loudly I wondered if it could hear it. The creature seemed curious, not immediately aggressive, but I couldn't shake off the feeling it was sizing us up. Its eyes must have been reflecting some light because I caught a glint once or twice, and that was enough to make my legs feel weak. We kept moving, always with our backs half turned towards it, making sure we could still see where it was. The trees seemed to close in. Every branch and trunk took on this sinister look. I couldn't tell how long this lasted. Probably just a few minutes, but it felt like hours. The tension was suffocating. At one point, one of the hikers nearly stumbled over a root, and I swear all of us stopped breathing for a second, expecting the creature to charge. But it didn't. It just stayed there, lurking, as if drawing a line in the dirt that we were not meant to cross. We managed to reach a more open area, a slight clearing where the trees thinned out enough to get a phone signal. The woman fumbled with her phone, her hands shaking so badly I could hear the plastic case rattling. She tried calling someone, I don't know who, maybe a relative or maybe the authorities, but I could tell she was just as unsure as the rest of us about what to say. There's a giant thing in the woods. Sounds insane, even if you've just seen it. Her voice was shaky, but low enough not to carry too far. Whoever she tried calling didn't pick up immediately, and she just cursed under her breath, looking over her shoulder at the tree line. I kept my eyes locked on the spot where we last saw it. Nothing moved. The wind picked up slightly, rustling the leaves, and in that moment I felt this strange release of tension. The creature didn't show itself again. It was like it let us go. We stood there for a good few minutes, expecting something to come charging out, but nothing happened. The forest remained quiet, but now it felt a bit more normal. The silence was no longer so loaded. Eventually, we decided to head back to the road. We stuck together until we hit the asphalt, and then we split up. Each of us needed to get home, process what the hell just happened. I remember driving back to Barton, hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles were white. The streets were empty. It was late after all, and my mind was racing. I had this weird mix of fear, shock, and a sort of baffled excitement. I knew what I'd seen, or at least what I thought I saw. But how do you explain something like that? In the days after, I tried to tell a couple of people what happened. I got some laughs, some weird looks. A friend suggested maybe I'd seen a bear standing upright, or some tall guy in a fur coat playing a prank. No one understood the feeling of that moment, the weight of the silence, the shape in the dark. I knew it wasn't a normal animal, and I'm not the kind of person who chases myths or tries to convince everyone I've seen something impossible. But I can't forget how it felt to be watched by something that doesn't fit into our everyday world. To this day, I still can't fully explain it. Was it a Bigfoot? I don't know what else to call it. All I know is it was huge, it was there, and it was aware of us. It let us know we were in its space. And then, just as quietly as it appeared, it faded back into the trees, leaving us confused and shaken and alone with our thoughts. I've never gone back to that trail. The memory of those footprints and that strange rumbling sound still makes my skin crawl. Whenever I think about it, I get that same nervous flutter in my stomach, and I start remembering how silent the woods became. I can't prove it. I have no photo, no recording, just this lingering feeling and a story that most people won't believe. But I know what I felt that night in Barton. I know what I saw, or at least what I think I saw, and that's enough to keep me from ever going back out there after dark again. Story 8. Back in 2015, I was living in a small, quiet corner of Maine, not far from the woods. I worked as a carpenter, mostly fixing old barns and farmhouses, and I liked the calm routine of that life. I remember that night so vividly. Honestly, it still makes my stomach tighten just thinking about it. It was late, probably around 10 or 11, and I'd just settled in after dinner when my neighbor Eliza showed up at my door. She seemed worried, maybe even a little shaken up. She told me she had heard strange noises coming from her old barn behind her house, something heavy moving around in there. She wasn't the kind of person to scare easily, and I could see the fear in her eyes. I figured it might be a raccoon, or maybe a fox scrounging for food. I offered to go check it out with her, just to set her mind at ease. We walked through her backyard with a lantern, trying not to slip on the wet, uneven ground. The grass was damp, and I remember the way it smelled, kind of like wet leaves and old wood. The barn itself was a big, old structure made from dark wooden boards that were half rotted in some places. The wind picked up a bit that night, making the boards creak. Every time the barn creaked, Eliza would stiffen slightly. I pretended I wasn't nervous, but truth is, the whole situation felt a bit off. It was just too quiet out there, except for the occasional rustle of something in the brush. When we got inside, everything looked normal at first. I shone the lantern around, tools hanging on hooks along the walls, stacks of hay bales near the back, a couple of old wooden barrels I'd seen 100 times before. Nothing out of place, no obvious signs of trouble. The smell of hay and old wood was familiar, but somehow felt heavier that night. The lantern's light was kind of weak, but it was enough to see that there was no large animal just standing there. Eliza stayed close behind me, too scared to step forward. I remember telling her quietly, "It's probably nothing." trying to sound confident, even though I was starting to feel uneasy. Then I noticed something odd. Along one of the support beams near the door, there were deep scratches, long, uneven gouges in the wood, like something with serious strength had dug its nails in. They weren't the kind of marks a raccoon or a fox would leave. They were too wide, too deep. I ran my fingers along them, and I could feel how roughly the wood had been torn. Just as I was trying to figure out what could have done that, Eliza said, in a shaky voice, that she had heard something like a low, deep growl the previous night. Not a bark, not a normal animal sound, but something more guttural, heavier. Before I could respond, I heard a faint rustle at the far end of the barn, right near the door we had left slightly ajar. I swung the lantern that way, and that's when we saw it. I didn't get a good, clear look, more like a silhouette, a large, broad shape covered in what seemed like thick, dark hair. It stood tall, far taller than any man I know. Its shoulders looked massive, and its head almost brushed the higher beams. I can't explain the feeling that hit me right then. Every hair on my body stood on end, my mouth went dry, and my heart was pounding so hard I could hardly hear anything else. I could sense Eliza behind me, barely breathing, completely frozen. The thing didn't charge at us. It didn't roar. It just stood there for a moment, watching us. I could just make out the shape of its head turning slightly, like it was trying to understand what it was looking at. The lantern's light flickered across its outline, and that's when I realized we were probably face to face with something we weren't supposed to be seeing. I can't say for sure what it was, but if you told me it was a Bigfoot, I wouldn't argue. Nothing else fits what I saw. Too tall, too bulky, and it had this strange, heavy presence, like you could feel it in the room before your eyes even confirmed it. There was this tense silence. I felt paralyzed. A fight-or-flight feeling came over me, but I couldn't choose either. I just stood there, waiting, hoping it wouldn't rush at us. It took a few heavy steps backward. The sound of its footfalls was deep, a dull thump on the wooden floor. Then it moved towards the open door, and before I could really process it, it slipped out into the darkness. Just like that, it was gone. No howl, no snarl, just the sound of it pushing past the old door and disappearing into the night. I was left there, holding the lantern and shaking so hard I thought I'd drop it. Eliza and I didn't say anything for a long moment. We just stood there, our eyes struggling to adjust after it left. My mind was racing. Did we really just see that? Was that actually what I think it was? Eventually, we stepped outside, lantern held high, but saw nothing except the dark shape of the forest beyond her property. There was no sign of it. It was almost like it had never been there, except I knew it had. We both knew it had. I remember how quiet it was outside. No crickets, no wind, just this awful silence. The next morning, after we'd both managed to get at least a little bit of sleep, we checked around the barn in the daylight. Sure enough, there were large footprints in the soft ground near the door. They were huge, longer than my boot, and much wider. I tried to make sense of them. Maybe it was a bear. But bears don't leave footprints like that. They don't stand like that. Whatever left those prints was something else entirely. I looked at Eliza. She looked at me, and we both knew we shouldn't go spreading this around town. People would call us crazy, or worse, come out armed and cause trouble. We decided to keep quiet. After all, it didn't hurt us. It didn't destroy anything besides leaving some scratches. It just showed up, stared at us, and left. I still fix up barns and houses around the area, and I still see Eliza from time to time. We never spoke in detail about it again. It's like we have this unspoken agreement to leave it be. But I'll never forget what happened that night, and I know she won't either. Every time I pass by her barn, even now, I get this nervous twist in my gut. I always glance at the door, half expecting to see that shape lurking in the shadows. It hasn't come back, at least not that I'm aware of, but the memory alone is enough to keep me cautious. I don't know what we saw. I can't explain it. I've tried to rationalize it 100 times, but no matter how I spin it, I'm left with the same unsettling conclusion. We saw something that doesn't fit into any category of wildlife I know, and it seemed curious, or maybe just wary of us, before it decided it wanted no part of the encounter and vanished into the night. Since that day, I've thought a lot about how many other people might have had a similar experience, but never said a word. Maybe these things are around more often than we realize, slipping in and out of our lives so quietly that most of us never notice. I can't prove anything, and I'm not here to convince anyone. I know what I saw. I remember the smell of the hay, the feel of the scratched wood under my hand, and that massive silhouette standing just a few yards away. That's enough to keep me awake some nights. Even now, thinking about it makes me uneasy. It was real, and it happened in that old barn on that quiet night, and then it ended as abruptly as it began. To this day, I have no real explanation. It's just something I have to live with, a mystery that still gives me chills every time I think back on it. Story 9. I remember it was sometime in late summer 2016, a day like any other in Milwood, Ohio. I'd finished my shift at the garage, where I'd spent most of the day under the hood of a rusted old Ford, and then stopped at the local bar for a quick beer. It's something I usually did, nothing special. I knew most of the guys there, and we'd sit around sharing small talk, maybe swapping stories about old customers or weird repairs we'd handled. That evening, though, there was a slightly different buzz in the air. I overheard a couple of regulars talking about strange noises coming from the woods outside town and some oversized footprints someone had supposedly found near the old trail. I didn't pay much attention. Around here you hear nonsense all the time. Milwood's small and quiet, and people get bored. They make things up just for fun. After one beer, I started heading home. The sun was low, the sky a sort of burnt orange, fading into a murkier grey as it got darker. I always walked home. It's a short distance, and the road runs alongside a patch of forest, not exactly deep wilderness, but enough trees and brush that it feels separated from the rest of town. It wasn't a place that ever made me nervous. I'd grown up around here, and that path was as familiar as my own backyard. As I walked, I started to notice how still everything felt. Usually there'd be the distant hum of someone's TV through a window, or a dog barking, sometimes even a car passing every now and then. That evening, though, it was dead quiet. It wasn't just the absence of noise. It was a strange kind of silence that almost pressed on my ears. I tried to brush it off, focusing on the soft crunch of gravel under my boots. But then I heard something else, a low, deep sound, almost like someone clearing their throat, but far too guttural, too heavy to be human. It came from the trees on my left, maybe 20 or 30 feet in. I slowed down, straining to see what could be making that noise. The hairs on my neck stood up. I felt like I was being watched. It sounds cliché, but I swear I had the strongest sensation that there were eyes on me. I scanned the tree line, squinting in the dim light. That's when I saw it. At first, just a shape, tall, broad, a dark figure partially hidden by leaves. I couldn't make out details immediately, but I knew it wasn't a deer or a bear. It stood upright, like a person, but way taller than anyone I'd ever seen. It was covered in what looked like thick, dark hair. For a moment I thought I was seeing something impossible. My heart started hammering so loud I half expected it to echo in that silence. I froze, not sure if I should run or try to keep calm. Part of me thought maybe my eyes were playing tricks in the fading light. But as I focused, it shifted slightly, stepping a bit clearer into view. I could see a kind of shape to its shoulders, the bulk of its torso, and something about its posture that felt powerful. It didn't bolt away like a deer would. It seemed to be studying me, almost curious. My mouth went dry, and I realized I wasn't breathing properly. Every sense I had was screaming at me that this thing, whatever it was, could tear me in half if it wanted. Before I could even decide what to do, I saw headlights approaching from behind me. The glare cut through the tree line just enough that I think the thing noticed it too. As the car got closer, I realized it was the sheriff's cruiser. Sheriff Thompson often drove this route, keeping an eye on the outskirts. He must have noticed something was off because his car slowed to a crawl. The headlights lit up the area just enough that I could finally see the creature's outline more clearly. It was at least 7 feet tall, maybe more. Big shoulders, long arms, a head that was shaped almost like a person's but covered in hair. It wasn't a costume. I know a guy in a suit when I see one, and this was different. I could feel it. I don't know how else to say it. There was a presence to it. The cruiser stopped a little ahead of me, and Sheriff Thompson leaned forward, looking in the same direction as I was. He must have seen it too, because I heard him suck in a sharp breath. He didn't shout. He didn't even open the door right away. He just sat there, one hand near his holster, but not drawing his weapon. I think he was as shocked as I was. We both stared, and for a handful of seconds, everything seemed suspended in that bizarre quiet. The creature never growled or bared teeth, at least none that I saw. It just stood there, examining us. And then, just as suddenly as it appeared, it stepped backward, deeper into the brush. It moved smoothly, not lumbering like a bear or making the crashing sounds I'd expect from something that size. It just slipped away, blending back into the darkness until the headlights no longer caught its form. Gone. I remember standing there, feeling my face hot and my heart pounding in my ears. The sheriff got out of his car slowly. He asked me in a low voice, "You see that, right?" I managed to nod. He stepped a bit closer to the edge of the tree line, shining his flashlight around, but there was nothing. No broken branches, no fresh prints that we could see from where we were standing. Just the fading light of dusk and the normal shapes of the forest. I think we were both in shock. I wanted to say something smart or ask him what the hell that thing was, but I didn't have the words. My mouth just wouldn't work. After a minute or two, he told me I should head home. He didn't say it rudely. It was more like he wanted to keep things calm. I nodded and kept walking toward my place, glancing over my shoulder every few steps. The sheriff stayed behind for a bit, shining his light into the woods, maybe trying to catch another glimpse. I don't know what he did after that, but I'm pretty sure he was rattled. I got home that night feeling like my brain was scrambling to process what I'd seen. I locked the doors, even though I never usually bothered. I sat in my kitchen, replaying everything in my mind, every movement, every shape, the sound of that strange, low noise. It all felt so real, and yet so impossible at the same time. I tried to think logically. Maybe it was a bear with some weird posture, but I've seen plenty of wildlife around here, and nothing matches what I saw. That was no damn bear. I didn't sleep well. My mind kept wandering back to the rumors I'd overheard at the bar. Giant footprints, strange noises. Maybe it had been going on for a while, but nobody took it seriously. And here I was, one of the guys who rolled his eyes at such stories, now sitting in my dark kitchen, feeling more unnerved than I ever had in my life. The weirdest part is how it ended. The creature just left, like it didn't care to threaten us or prove anything. It just let us see it for a moment before disappearing. It's been years since that night, and I still can't fully explain what I witnessed. The sheriff and I never talked about it much afterward. He got quiet whenever I hinted at it. Maybe he didn't want to be the crazy lawman who believed in monsters. Maybe I didn't want to be that guy either. All I know is that what I saw that day changed the way I think about these woods and what might live out there. The memory still makes my stomach twist. I can picture those eyes watching me from the shadows and feel that heavy silence pressing down on me. No matter how many times I try to rationalize it, I always end up coming back to the same haunting conclusion. I saw something I can't explain, something that doesn't fit neatly into what we're told exists, and I have no idea why it let me see it, or why it just vanished into the darkness, leaving me with nothing but questions. Story 10. I still remember it so clearly, even though it's been years since that morning in 2017. I had been living in Maple Valley, Virginia, a tiny rural place not many outsiders hear about, working as a small-town journalist. It was one of those towns where the biggest stories usually revolve around high school football rivalries or the occasional cattle auction. But back then, there were these strange rumors spreading quietly. People talked in low voices about odd sightings at the forest's edge, things moving among the trees that didn't match any animal around here. Most folks just brushed it off as nonsense. I don't know what got into me, but I decided to look into it. Early one morning, before the sun was fully up, I grabbed my camera, a small notebook, and headed out to a part of the forest no one seemed to frequent. It's not like I was some fearless adventurer. I was nervous. But I was also hungry for something real, something that could break the cycle of mundane stories I'd been churning out. The forest was quiet that day, and right from the start, something felt off. Not in a dramatic, movie-like way, but in that subtle sense you get when you walk into a room and everyone stops talking, a kind of tension in the atmosphere. The trail I took was barely a trail at all. Tall trees filtered the early morning light, making everything look dim and uneven. The ground was soft from recent rain, my boots sinking slightly in the mud. After only a few minutes, I noticed footprints. They were huge, much bigger than my own size 10 boots. I tried to convince myself they belonged to a bear, but something about them looked wrong. The shape wasn't quite right. The toes seemed different. I took a few photos, my heart thumping because I already knew I was looking at something unusual. Around me, the birds seemed quieter than normal, as if they too were wary of something out there. I kept moving, pushing deeper. I'm not sure why I felt the need to keep going, but I did. Then I started noticing branches snapped high up in the trees. I'm talking about breaks more than 7 feet off the ground. They weren't the kind of breaks you'd see from a storm. These looked like something had twisted or snapped them intentionally. I tried to stay calm. I kept telling myself I was just scaring myself for no reason. But when I took a closer look at those footprints, I realized they formed a rough path. Something heavy had passed through here, and recently. Maybe 20 minutes into my little hike, I heard it. It was a deep, guttural sound that I can't compare to anything else I know. It wasn't a growl. It wasn't a roar. It was more like a low, resonant moan that vibrated through my chest. In that instant, I froze. I remember gripping my camera so tight my knuckles went white. I could feel sweat forming on my palms, and my heart started pounding harder. It wasn't just fear. It was this overwhelming sense that I shouldn't be here, like I had just crossed a line into territory that wasn't mine. I considered turning back. Hell, I considered running. But I also felt that strange pull, curiosity, stupidity, whatever you want to call it, that kept me inching forward. I moved as quietly as I could, trying to see through the dense leaves and undergrowth. And then I saw it. It stood behind a cluster of ferns and small trees, partially hidden, but there was no mistaking its size. It was tall, maybe 7 or 8 feet, broad shoulders, covered in dark brown hair that looked matted and thick. Its face wasn't exactly like a human's, but not like an ape's either. Somewhere in between, and those eyes, they seemed to catch the light in a weird way, reflecting something back at me, something smart and aware. I could see muscles shifting under the hair as it breathed. It didn't seem panicked or angry. It just stared. In that moment, I felt more vulnerable than I ever have in my life. I mean, I'm a pretty ordinary guy. I'm not a hunter. I'm not a survival expert. I'm just a journalist who wanted a story. Standing there, facing this thing that shouldn't exist, I realized how small and clueless I was. I raised my hands slowly, like I was showing I meant no harm. I don't know why I did that. Maybe I thought it would calm the thing down, let it know I wasn't a threat. It didn't move closer, but I could hear its heavy breathing. It was calm, but not relaxed. More like it was deciding what to do about me. I tried to reach for my camera, which was already in my right hand, but I was so scared of making any sudden moves. I managed to lift it a bit, snapping a few shaky photos without even looking through the viewfinder. I have no idea if any of them turned out. My heart was hammering in my ears, and my body was telling me to run, but I stayed put. I just stood there, staring at this thing that seemed as real and solid as the ground under my feet. We must have locked eyes for a good 10-15 seconds. I can't say we communicated, but I swear it felt like it understood I wasn't there to harm it. Then, without warning, it turned and walked away. Its stride was long and purposeful, each step making this soft thud against the forest floor. It didn't sprint or make any huge leaps. It just casually vanished into the deeper shadows, like it had every right to be there. I just stood there, my mind racing, my muscles aching from tension. I realized my jaw was clenched so tight it hurt. I wanted to run after it, but my body wouldn't move. By the time I regained some composure, it was gone. The forest was quiet again, but now it felt like I was the intruder. I felt shaky, nauseated even. I stumbled back the way I came, turning my head every few steps to make sure it wasn't following me. When I got back to town, I tried to tell a couple of people what had happened. No one really took me seriously. The local cops nodded, pretended to listen, but I could see it in their eyes. They thought I'd maybe seen a bear or had a weird dream out there. A few folks kind of laughed it off. One neighbor said something like, "Guess you found the boogeyman." That stung a bit, but I couldn't blame them. I wouldn't have believed it myself if I hadn't been there. I wrote a piece about it. I kept it factual, avoided any over-the-top claims. Just described what I saw. The footprints, the snapped branches, that indescribable sound, and a large figure covered in hair. I didn't call it Bigfoot in the article, didn't use that word at all. I just put it out there as a strange encounter. The reaction was mixed. Some people said I was sensationalizing nothing. Others got really curious and started looking at the woods differently, with a kind of respectful fear. I had a few people pull me aside and whisper that they believed me, that they'd always suspected something lived out there. But most pretended I'd lost it. To this day, I still can't explain what I saw. I have those footprints in my memory, those sounds still lingering in my head. And those eyes. I can't forget those eyes. They weren't the eyes of some mindless animal. They were intelligent, judging me, deciding if I was worth the trouble. It's been years, and I've never seen it again. Sometimes I think I should go back out there, try to find more evidence, but I never do. Part of me doesn't want to know more. Part of me is happy just leaving it alone. All I can say is that on that quiet morning in Maple Valley, something I can't explain crossed my path. It appeared, stared right at me, and then slipped back into the forest like it had never been there. No big drama, no attacks, no Hollywood ending. Just a brief moment that changed how I look at the world. Even now, when I think about it, I get chills. I'm not here to convince anyone. I just know what I saw, and no matter how much time passes, I'll never forget it. Story 11. I remember it was sometime around late morning in 2018, though I don't recall the exact date. It was early enough that the dew was still clinging to the leaves, and the air had that moist, earthy smell. I'd gone out to the edge of Maple Valley, a small rural town in Virginia, where I'd been working as a local journalist for a few years. Normally, I covered mundane stuff, local fairs, school board meetings, the occasional odd crime story. But lately, I'd been hearing these strange rumors from a handful of residents. They swore something large and hairy had been spotted at the forest's edge, near the old logging trails. Others brushed it off, saying it was just a tall bear, or maybe some guy in a costume trying to scare people. No one really believed there was anything out of the ordinary, at least not officially. I guess that's what pushed me to go out there myself, to either confirm it was nonsense or find something worth reporting. I packed light, a small camera, a notepad, and a bottle of water. I figured I'd be out there for a few hours at most. The forest around Maple Valley wasn't exactly huge, but it was thick in some places, and there were old paths that didn't show up on any modern trail maps. I headed down a lesser-known track off a back road, one I'd learned about from a local hunter who claimed it was a good spot for deer. The deeper I walked, the quieter it got. At first, the chirping of birds and the rustle of small animals in the undergrowth kept me company, but after maybe half an hour that all seemed to fade. It was eerie. It wasn't like total silence, but the forest's usual background noise just softened. I started feeling uneasy without really knowing why. As I pushed through some denser brush, I noticed these footprints on a patch of soft ground. They weren't like any I'd seen before. I'm not a tracker, but I've seen my share of bear prints in mud, and these were different, bigger for sure and shaped oddly, more elongated, almost like a human's footprint, but way too large and broader around the toes. I crouched down to snap a photo. That's when I caught a whiff of something foul. It was faint, but it reminded me of something rotten or musty, like wet fur mixed with decay. I can't quite describe it, but it made my stomach churn a little. I tried to keep calm. The rational side of my brain told me it was probably just a weird bear print. Maybe it had stepped funny or something. But as I was squatting there, focusing on getting a clear shot of the print, I heard this low, resonant sound. It wasn't a growl exactly, and it wasn't a grunt. It was almost like a long, deep exhale, but with a rumble underneath it, coming from somewhere to my left, deeper in the woods. I froze. My heart hammered in my chest so loudly, I was sure anything out there could hear it. Slowly, I shifted my position behind a thick clump of ferns and peered through the foliage. I swear I tried to be as quiet as possible, barely breathing, listening for any hint of movement. The sound came again, and this time I was able to pinpoint its direction. It was coming from somewhere behind a cluster of large tree trunks, maybe 30 or 40 feet away. The lighting in that part of the forest was strange, almost dim, even though it wasn't that late. The canopy was dense, and the sun struggled to break through in patches. As I scanned the area, I saw it, a tall, dark figure moving between the trees. It was far enough away that I couldn't make out every detail, but what I could see didn't match anything I knew. This thing was upright, definitely standing on two legs, and it looked massive. Its shoulders were broad, and its body was covered in dark, shaggy hair, not the sleek fur you might see on a bear, but something longer, more uneven. I remember thinking the head looked slightly pointed at the top, maybe because of the hair. It moved with this strange, smooth gait, stepping around roots and over rocks so quietly that I barely heard its feet touch the ground. My mouth went dry. I wanted to take a photo, but my hands were shaking, and I was terrified that the slightest noise would give me away. I didn't even know if this thing could see me. For a moment, it just stood there, partially hidden behind a large trunk, and seemed to be sniffing the air. I swear I could see its nostrils flare, or at least see some sort of movement on its face, as if it was testing the scent in the breeze. My skin crawled at the thought of it smelling me. I tried to steady my breathing and control the panic swelling inside me. Then it stepped out a bit more, and I caught a better glimpse. It looked taller than any person I've ever seen, maybe 7 or 8 feet. Its arms hung low, definitely longer than a human's. I couldn't make out the eyes clearly, but I felt them sweep over the area. There was no sound from it now, just this sense that it knew something was out of place. It didn't roar. It didn't charge at me. It just lingered. That silence was almost worse than if it had made some terrifying sound. It made everything feel more real, more primal. After a few seconds, it moved off to the right, disappearing behind thicker brush. I stayed there, completely still, listening. I waited, maybe a minute or two, not daring to move. The forest around me was still oddly quiet, as if every creature in that area had decided to hold its breath. Eventually, I mustered the courage to take a few slow steps toward where it had stood, just to confirm I wasn't losing my mind. But I was careful. My heart was still pounding. I knew I could be putting myself in danger, but I had to see if there were more footprints or some sign to prove I wasn't hallucinating. I found more of those large tracks scattered around the area. The ground was disturbed in a way that didn't look random, like something heavy had been pacing. I also noticed long scratches on the bark of a tree. Not deep claw marks like a bear's, more like scrapes made by something tall enough to reach high and rake the trunk with heavy nails or fingers. That's when the gravity of the situation really hit me. Whatever it was strong, large, and it sure as hell wasn't some guy playing a prank. No human could naturally make prints like that, and no local I knew matched this massive, hairy figure moving so gracefully through the underbrush. I thought about trying to follow it, to get a better look or maybe a clearer photo, but my instincts screamed at me to back off. I felt like I was trespassing in something else's territory. The feeling of dread that washed over me was like nothing I'd experienced before. Every cell in my body told me to get out of there. I turned and headed back, trying to keep a steady pace and not break into a run. I kept looking over my shoulder, expecting to see it behind me, but I never did. Back in town, I tried to explain what I'd seen to my colleagues. They gave me looks that hovered somewhere between pity and skepticism. Most people said I probably saw a bear standing oddly on its hind legs. Others said maybe it was a trick of the light. I even heard 1 or 2 joke that I'd stumbled onto some secret filming for a cryptid show. No one really took me seriously, and I get it. If I hadn't seen it myself, I might have been doubtful too. My photos of the footprints weren't conclusive. They just showed vague impressions in dirt, nothing definitive. I had no shot of the creature itself, just my word. But I know what I saw. Over the following weeks, I heard more whispers around Maple Valley, people claiming to have heard weird noises at dusk, seeing strange silhouettes moving at the forest's edge, even a few who swore they caught glimpses of the same creature. But no one had solid proof, and eventually the rumors died down. Life in our quiet town went back to normal, except whenever I drive by that stretch of forest, I feel a knot in my stomach. The memory of that strange presence, the way it moved, the quiet tension that filled the air. It sticks with me. I can't explain it, and I guess I never will. I don't know if it was some undiscovered species, a rare animal off its usual path, or something beyond any explanation that makes sense in our everyday world. All I know is that I saw it, and it was real enough to shake me to my core. I've never gone back into that part of the woods alone. Maybe it was just passing through. Maybe it still watches from the trees now and then, waiting and observing. I honestly don't know. What I do know is that something out there doesn't fit into the neat little boxes we like to draw around our reality. And despite how unsettling that feels, I can't deny that it happened, and I can't shake the feeling that we share these quiet places with things we might never fully understand. After all this time, It still gives me chills. Story 12. I remember that evening in 2019 so vividly, it still makes my stomach tighten. I had just gotten off work, a long shift full of deadlines and grumpy faces, and I desperately needed a moment of quiet. I'm in Melbourne, Florida, right near the coast, and you'd think I'd hit the beach like everyone else. But I don't know. That day I felt this urge to get away from the crowds and head toward the tree line. There's a small wooded area not too far from where I live. It's not a huge forest or anything, but it's thick with twisted trees, dense foliage, and these half-forgotten trails that never really see much foot traffic. The humidity was suffocating, like walking through a hot, damp towel. But I could handle that. I'm used to Florida weather. As I moved deeper into the woods, the usual background noise was there at first. The buzzing of insects, that low hum of life you always hear when you're out in nature. But then, after maybe 10 minutes of walking, everything seemed to stop. No birds, no crickets, nothing. At first, I thought I had just zoned out and not noticed them, but I actually stopped and listened. It was dead silent. I'm talking about an eerie silence that makes you realize something's off. The air itself felt heavier. You know that feeling when you enter a room right after a serious argument and you sense tension in the air, even if everyone's quiet? It was like that, except in the middle of the woods. I took another few steps, careful not to make too much noise. My heart was already beating a little faster, and I remember feeling a shiver run down my spine. Not a cold breeze, just a sudden spike of fear. I was on a barely marked trail, the kind where you see hints of an old path, but it's mostly covered with leaves and wild growth. Then I noticed the footprints. At first, they didn't register as footprints, just large, odd marks in the dirt. They were wide and elongated, definitely not human. We do have animals in Florida, obviously, but this looked strange. They weren't like bear prints or gator tracks. I leaned down to get a better look, and I could see the ground was pressed down with a weight heavier than a person's. Some nearby shrubs were bent and broken, as if something big had pushed through with ease. The weirdest part was how fresh it looked. The broken branches still had leaves that hadn't fully wilted. Whatever made these tracks had come through recently, maybe minutes before. At this point, I wasn't sure if I should keep going or turn around. Part of me was screaming to leave, but I guess I was too curious or too stubborn. I took a few careful steps forward, following the direction of those prints, and that's when I heard a sound I can only describe as a low, resonant grunt. It wasn't super loud, more like a distant rumble of thunder, but it had a depth that felt unnatural for a human, or even the usual animals we have out here. I tried to keep my breathing steady. I'm not some adrenaline junkie or anything like that. I'm just a regular guy. But something about this situation pinned me to the spot. I wasn't sure if I was safe, but I also felt a strange pull, like I wanted to understand what was out there. The sun was dipping below the horizon, casting these long shadows through the trees. It wasn't dark yet, but the light was fading, giving everything a kind of dim, reddish glow. I walked a little farther until I found a small clearing. The trees opened up a bit here, letting in some of that weak evening light. And that's when I saw it. It stood near the edge of the clearing, just beyond the thicker vegetation. It was tall. I can't say exactly how tall, but definitely taller than a big man. It was covered in dark hair, not neat or uniform, but thick and somewhat matted. It wasn't a bear, and it wasn't a person in a suit. The way it stood, its posture, just didn't suggest anything fake. It was solid, broad-shouldered with long arms. Its face wasn't clearly visible from where I stood, partly shadowed by leaves and the angle of the light. But I could tell it was watching me. In that moment, my blood felt like ice. My first instinct was to run, but something about its demeanor kept me rooted. It didn't rush at me, didn't make any threatening moves. It was just there, staring right back at me like it was trying to figure out what I was. I felt like a trespasser, like I had wandered into its territory without permission. I tried to remain calm, inhaling slowly through my nose and exhaling through my mouth, hoping it would sense that I wasn't a threat. My legs felt weak, but I didn't want to show fear by bolting away. I just stood there, locked in this silent exchange. We must have looked at each other for maybe 30 seconds or a minute. Hard to tell because time felt warped. The creature just tilted its head slightly, like it was curious. I could see its mass, its muscle under that dark hair, and the way it blended into the shadows was unnerving. Even in that fading light, it seemed at home in the darkness. It had a presence that's hard to put into words, solid, real and intelligent, but entirely foreign to me. After what felt like an eternity, it started to move. Not abruptly, but with slow, deliberate steps backward. It didn't turn around and run. It just sort of faded into the foliage, each step careful and quiet, despite its size. 1 second it was there, and the next it was gone, swallowed by the trees and the dim light. I could still sense its presence for a few more moments, as if my body knew it was near, but I couldn't see it anymore. Then, as if someone had flipped a switch, I started hearing sounds of insects again, a distant rustle of leaves, normal forest sounds, as if nature had decided it was safe to resume its usual chorus. I was left standing in that clearing, heart hammering, sweat trickling down my back. I must have waited there another minute or two, just trying to gather myself. Eventually, I decided I'd seen enough. I turned around and headed back toward my car as calmly as I could manage, though my mind was racing and I could feel my hands shaking. I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see it following me, but it never showed itself again. Later that evening, after I got home, I sat on my couch for a long time without turning on the TV. I tried to put the pieces together, what I had seen, what it could mean. I know some people have talked about strange sightings in the woods, old legends or so I'd heard, but I'd never paid them any attention. Melbourne might have its share of local tales, but they're usually about alligators or weird fish off the coast. Nothing like this. I called a friend I trust, someone who's into local lore and ghost stories, and shared a rough version of what happened. He sounded surprised and said he'd heard rumors about sightings like that long ago. But nothing recent, nothing documented, just whispered stories that people never took seriously. From that day on, I've looked at the local woods differently. I still pass by them, still drive near them, but I haven't gone back in at dusk, and I doubt I ever will. When I think about it now, what gets to me isn't just that I saw something big and hairy in the woods. It's the feeling that I encountered something that lives alongside us, hidden, unnoticed by most people. It didn't hurt me. It didn't charge at me. It just watched me, as if deciding whether I belonged there. Then it vanished as quietly as it appeared. The weird part is how normal everything went back to being afterward. I went to work the next day. People talked about the weather and weekend plans, as if nothing was different. But for me, something had changed. I keep thinking back to that moment of silence in the woods, the strange footprints, the towering shape looking back at me. I wish I had an explanation. I wish I could dismiss it as a trick of the light or some wandering animal. But I can't. I know what I saw. Something real. Something out there. Even now, as I type this, I get goosebumps. It's not like I think it's lurking behind my house or something, but knowing it's out there somewhere, roaming those dense patches of forest, makes me realize how little we know about our own backyard. I've never told many people this story, because who'd believe it? But I'll never forget it. All these years later, the memory is as clear as ever, and I can't shake the feeling that what I saw shouldn't be brushed off or ignored. I don't know what it was, and I'm not sure I want to know. It appeared out of nowhere, and then was gone, leaving me more aware of the dark, quiet corners of this world and the things that might be hiding there. Story 13. I remember that morning vividly, even though I've tried to push it from my mind so many times. It was around late September 2020, early in the day, a couple of hours after sunrise. I was up in those foothills near Ashgrove, Wyoming, just like I always was before heading off to work. Normally, these walks were routine, peaceful even. I'd stroll along this less-traveled trail that followed a small stream, listening to the water trickle over stones, the wind pushing through the pines, and the distant chatter of birds that I still can't name properly. That day felt different right from the start, though I can't say why for sure. The air had a strange crispness to it, like the forest was holding its breath. The path I followed wasn't something you'd find in a guidebook, just a kind of narrow track worn down by deer or maybe a few other hikers who knew about the place. The trees around me were tall and old, thick pine trunks with moss that looked like green velvet, and the forest floor was soft with needles, muffling the sound of my footsteps. I noticed something odd as I moved deeper along the trail. Several branches from the nearby trees were bent into these strange arcs. I'm not talking about a branch cracking because of a storm or the weight of snow. These were bent in a way that made my stomach flip. Some were pulled down toward the ground and pinned under other branches, almost like crude structures or markers. It didn't look accidental. I leaned in closer to one of these formations, expecting to see maybe some frayed rope, tool marks, or anything that would make sense. Maybe another person had set them up as a weird joke, or hunters marking a trail. But I found nothing. The wood looked like it had been twisted gently, without snapping, which seemed impossible. I couldn't imagine a human doing that with bare hands, and there were no cuts, no saw marks, just wood silently forced into a new shape. My gut told me to turn around, but I was too curious, so I kept going. Maybe I wanted to prove to myself I wasn't spooked that easily. Further along the path, I noticed the forest was quieter than usual. The birds had stopped calling. Even the faint rustling of squirrels or chipmunks in the underbrush was gone. It was like the forest hit mute. That's when a chill worked its way up my spine and settled at the base of my neck. I paused, scanning the tree line. Usually, if a predator like a bear or a mountain lion is around, the small animals go quiet, but you'd at least hear the breeze in the branches. Here, it was just dead silence. I don't know what made me lift my head, but I did, and right at the edge of my vision, maybe 20 or 30 yards away, there was something tall moving behind a cluster of trees. I froze. It was big, taller than any man I've ever seen, and broad. Its outline was coated in dark, shaggy hair, and it wasn't standing upright in a stiff, human way. It had this slight hunch, like it was comfortable in the forest, blending in, and I just happened to spot it by dumb luck. I didn't even breathe. My heart was hammering, and my hands felt clammy. I remember thinking, this can't be a bear. It's too tall. The shape is off. Bears stand on hind legs sometimes, but this thing's proportions were different. Longer arms, not as bulky in the gut, and it seemed to stare right at me. I could feel its eyes, even though I couldn't pick out any details of its face. For a moment, I wondered if I was losing my mind. I blinked hard, but it was still there, shifting its weight from one foot to the other, as if deciding what to do next. We watched each other for what felt like minutes, though I'm sure it was only a few seconds. My ears were ringing from the tension. I wanted to say something, but what the hell do you say in that situation? I didn't dare make a sound. I had this insane urge to run, but something in me said that might be a bad idea. I tried to keep my body language calm, even though my gut was screaming at me to get out of there. Then, as quietly as it had appeared, it started to back away. No big dramatic movement, No breaking branches, no grunts or growls. It just slid into the background of the woods. Its movement was so controlled and deliberate. I lost sight of it behind a patch of thick underbrush and some fallen timber. The moment it was gone, I realized how fast I'd been breathing. My head was spinning a bit, adrenaline pumping. I strained my ears to catch any sound of it leaving, heavy footsteps, snapping twigs, but I heard nothing. It was just gone. Within a minute or two, I noticed the forest starting to turn back on. A single bird chirped, then another. The wind picked up again, rustling the needles overhead. It was as if that presence had pressed a mute button on the entire area while it was there. I turned around and headed straight back down the trail, trying not to break into a run. Back home in Ashgrove, I couldn't stop shaking. I went online first, trying to find anything about strange sightings around our area. Then I checked local folklore. I found what I guess you'd call a rabbit hole of stories about these big, hairy creatures people sometimes see in the woods. Bigfoot, Sasquatch, call it what you want. I'd heard the name before, everyone has, but I never really believed any of that. It sounded like campfire stories, things people made up to scare each other. But now, I didn't know what to think. I remembered one of the old-timers in town, a guy I sometimes chat with at the market, had mentioned something decades ago about weird happenings in the forest. At the time, I thought he was just telling tall tales. After my experience, I quietly asked him if he'd ever seen anything odd out there. He got real serious and just said something like, "Sometimes there are watchers in those woods." He wouldn't elaborate much, just hinted that a few people had seen something, but nobody ever got hurt. The way he spoke made me feel like he believed it, or at least believed the people who claimed to have seen it. I didn't go blabbing around town. Honestly, I was too rattled, and I didn't want folks to think I was nuts. But I knew what I saw. There was something out there, something that knew how to twist branches without tools, something that could freeze the entire forest with its presence, something that stood there watching me like it understood what I was. And then it vanished, as if the woods swallowed it up. To this day, I can't explain it. I never found footprints. I never heard any strange noises again. I've returned to that area a few times since, though not as often, and definitely not with the same carefree attitude. Every snap of a twig or sudden silence makes my skin crawl. I don't know what it wanted, or why it left me alone. I tried to tell myself it was just curious, checking me out, and then deciding I wasn't worth its time. I'm still a gardener here in town, and my life hasn't exactly changed in any big, dramatic way. But that memory is always there. It's a reminder that there are corners of this world that don't fit neatly into what we think we know. I never got a clear look at its face. I don't have a photo, no physical evidence. I only have that moment burnt into my mind, the way the branches bent, the sudden silence, and that massive, shadowy figure backing away into the pines without a sound. I guess the weirdest part is how it all just ended. No big confrontation, no grand finale. 1 minute I'm staring into the eyes of something completely unknown. The next minute I'm alone again, the forest humming back to life. It's like it allowed me a brief glimpse into a secret world and then slammed the door shut. I don't have a neat conclusion. I still can't explain it. But I'm certain it happened, and I know I'll never look at those quiet trails the same way again. Story 14. I remember it was late summer 2021, maybe early September. I was out in Pinecrest, California, exploring a section of the forest I'd never ventured into before. I'm a nature guide, and my whole job revolves around finding new, safe routes to show visitors. I know these woods pretty well. I've been doing this for years. But that day, I decided to push deeper, beyond the usual boundaries, searching for something fresh. Not because I felt reckless, but because I was curious. I just wanted to see if there was a scenic overlook, or a hidden meadow I could add to my future tours. The weather was decent, sunny enough, but not blistering hot. The canopy of pines and oaks filtered the light in a way that made everything feel warm, but not harsh. I started out early, probably around 7 in the morning, just after first light. At that hour, there weren't many people around. Most folks stuck to the popular trails, the ones with signs and clear markers. I set off into a part of the forest that had fewer markers, no recent signs of humans. I could tell it was less traveled by the way branches hung over what barely passed for a trail, and how the undergrowth felt thicker and harder to push through. For the first couple of hours, it was honestly kind of nice, quiet, peaceful. I heard all the usual forest sounds, birds calling, small critters scurrying around, leaves brushing against each other in the breeze. Nothing set off alarm bells. The only thing that did feel a bit off was a faint smell in the air, something I couldn't quite place. It wasn't the scent of a dead animal. Believe me, I know what that smells like. It was more musky, kind of like damp earth mixed with something else, something animal-like but not familiar to me. I tried not to overthink it. There are all kinds of creatures out there, and not every smell is going to be immediately recognizable. Still, there was this feeling in my gut, a subtle tension I couldn't shake. The forest felt denser somehow. I mean, yes, physically denser because I was going off the beaten path, but also heavier, quieter in a strange way. The birdsong started fading the deeper I went. The branches overhead seemed to twist together more closely, almost as if they were forming an archway that blocked out more and more of the sky. I noticed that some of the saplings and ferns were flattened in places, which suggested a large animal had moved through recently. Deer, maybe, or a bear. I've encountered black bears a handful of times, always nerve-wracking, but I know how to handle myself. I stayed cautious, quiet, and kept moving. It must have been around mid-morning when I heard something that made me freeze. A snap, like a branch breaking under significant weight, came from somewhere ahead of me. It wasn't just a twig under a squirrel. This was a thicker branch, the kind that cracks loudly when something heavy steps on it. I instinctively moved behind a thick trunk, peering carefully around. The forest floor was mostly shaded by now, but there were patches of filtered light. In one of those patches I saw movement. At first, I couldn't make sense of what I was seeing. There was a shape, large and covered in dark brownish hair, taller than any human I've guided, and broader across the shoulders too. This thing moved slowly, deliberately. It was walking upright, but it wasn't a bear standing on its hind legs. I've seen that before, and this looked different. The arms seemed longer, and the way it walked was too smooth, almost human in its gait, but heavier, more grounded. The hair was shaggy, and I could see it lift a hand. Yes, a hand, not a paw, to brush aside some leaves as it inspected the ground beneath them. The way it touched the earth felt intentional, like it was aware of what it was doing, aware of its surroundings in a way most animals aren't. My heart was pounding so hard I could barely hear anything else. I was terrified, but also strangely fascinated. I've heard stories, always dismissed them. Local rumors about Bigfoot or Sasquatch sightings, just campfire tales, I thought. But there it was, only a few dozen feet away. I held my breath, desperate not to alert it to my presence. I had no idea if it was aggressive, if it would charge. My mind was racing with questions. What does it eat? Is it territorial? Why this area? Has it seen me yet? The creature stepped into a slightly more open area, and I got a better look. It stood, I'd guess, at least 7 feet tall. The muscles in its back and legs were clearly visible beneath the thick hair. It didn't look like some upright gorilla, and it definitely wasn't a person in a suit. The proportions were all off for that. Its arms were too long, the torso too broad. And there was an intelligence in the way it moved that unsettled me. Not just animal instinct, Something else. I was trying not to lose my nerve when it suddenly paused. Its head lifted, and I could see part of its face. The face wasn't fully covered in hair. There was skin around the eyes and nose, kind of a leathery brownish tone. The eyes, when they locked onto my general direction, had this depth, something I can only describe as awareness. We made eye contact, I'm sure of it. Even with me half hidden behind a tree, I felt it looking directly at me, studying me. In that moment, I was certain that it knew I was there. My stomach dropped. I was thinking, what do I do now? Do I run? Do I stand still? Do I speak softly? I decided on absolute stillness, not wanting to provoke it. I felt this sweat trickling down the back of my neck. My hands were gripping the bark so hard I got splinters. I had no weapon on me. I don't carry a firearm when I'm out scouting. Maybe a whistle and a small knife, but that's it. Definitely nothing that would help against something this massive. It didn't charge. It didn't roar or growl. Instead, it just stared for a long moment. I could see its chest rising and falling with slow, steady breaths. Then, as if deciding I wasn't a threat, or maybe just not worth its time, it looked away. It went back to what it was doing, sniffing at the ground, examining some leaves, and then it moved on. I watched it walk deeper into the forest, barely making a sound. That was one of the eeriest parts. Despite its size, it was almost silent when it moved. I stayed behind that tree for what felt like ages, listening to my own heartbeat and the subtle rustling of leaves. The forest was quiet again, except for a few distant bird calls. Eventually, I mustered the courage to step out. There were footprints where it had stood, large, deep impressions in the soft earth, not quite shaped like a human foot, but not entirely animal-like either. The toes seemed more pronounced and spaced out. I didn't know what to do. Part of me wanted to take a photo with my phone, but something held me back. A strange sense that I shouldn't. Also, I was so rattled, I'm not sure I could have kept my hands steady. I decided I'd had enough exploration for one day. The route I had come to scout was instantly off the list for future tours. I wouldn't put any of my clients at risk or disturb this creature. I slowly retraced my steps, feeling uneasy with every sound. Even though I never saw it again on the way back, I couldn't shake the feeling that it could see me. I kept imagining it just out of sight, blending into the foliage, watching me leave. When I finally reached more familiar territory, where the trees parted and the trail widened, I realized how tense my shoulders and neck had become. My clothes were damp with sweat, and I felt shaky, like after a close call on a dangerous climb or a near miss with a bear. I've never been so relieved to step back onto a well-trodden path. Back in Pinecrest, I didn't know who to tell. I ended up mentioning it to one colleague, someone who'd also heard those stories but never believed them. He looked at me like he wasn't sure if I was pulling his leg or if I'd genuinely lost it. I didn't blame him. How do you describe something like this? I saw a giant, hairy, upright creature that looked me right in the eye. It sounds like a tabloid headline. I've never gone back to that spot. I don't lead tours anywhere near there. To be honest, every time I think about it, I get this chill. Not because it threatened me, it actually didn't. In fact, it almost acted like it belonged there in a way that I never could. But it's more the realization that something unknown, something people only whisper about, really could be out there. That's unsettling in a deep, primal way. I still guide people through other areas of the forest, the safer, well-mapped trails. I talk about the local wildlife, about respecting nature's boundaries, and I try to be more mindful of how much noise we make, how we interact with the environment. But I never tell my clients about what I saw. It's not worth the panic or the disbelief. I keep it to myself, and maybe that's for the best. Sometimes when I'm alone, I replay that moment in my head, the eyes meeting mine, the creature's calm departure. It's strange how it ended so abruptly, with no real explanation. It just wandered off, leaving me there to figure out what the hell happened. To this day, I have no solid explanation. I can't prove it. I can't fully explain why it didn't attack, or why I felt both terrified and almost humbled. All I know is that I saw something in those woods that I can't forget, something that changed the way I see this place forever. Pinecrest remains the same sleepy spot it's always been. The forest is still quiet, the trails still peaceful for the casual hikers who come here. But I know what I saw, and I know it's out there. That's something I carry with me every time I lace up my boots and head into the woods. I used to think I knew these forests like the back of my hand, that nothing could really surprise me out there. Turns out I was wrong. And even now, I can't tell if that realization makes me respect the woods more or fear them. Maybe both. Story 15. I still remember that day in early October 2022 like it just happened yesterday, even though I haven't told many people about it since. It was in Garfield, Montana, where I lived for a few years. I was always into hiking, nothing extreme, but I liked to explore off-the-beaten-path spots, away from all the familiar trails. I never really went looking for anything bizarre. Mostly I just liked to catch glimpses of deer or maybe a distant bear. I'd bring binoculars, a canteen, and an old faded map I got from a local ranger years ago. That day, I left my house before sunrise, determined to explore a more secluded, mountainous area. I knew it was going to be colder, and the air would get thinner as I climbed, so I packed carefully. When I first entered the area, I remember being struck by how quiet it was. Normally, when you start a hike, you hear a lot of birds, maybe squirrels rustling around, the breeze shifting through pines. But as I got deeper in, it just didn't sound right. There was this sudden hush, like nature had decided to hold its breath. I tried not to let it get to me. Silence happens sometimes if a predator is near, I thought. Maybe a mountain lion. That's when I first noticed these weird footprints in the muddy patches along the rocky path. They were huge, bigger than my own foot by a lot. I leaned down to compare my boot to one of them and got a strange sinking feeling in my stomach. They weren't shaped like a bear's print, and they definitely weren't human. They had this broad, almost wide pad and toes that looked weirdly spread out. I snapped a few pictures with my phone, just for my own reference. I didn't know what to think. As I moved on, I saw more unsettling signs. Branches bent at odd angles, small trees twisted around like something strong had forced them into shapes. It didn't look like natural wind damage. It looked deliberate, like someone, or something, had been marking the area. I remember feeling uneasy, but not panicked yet. I guess I was more curious than anything else. The terrain got steeper, and the air chilled in a way that made my jacket feel too thin. The pine trees stretched tall and close, creating odd shadows that made me keep looking over my shoulder. Eventually, I stopped to catch my breath and scan the ridge with my binoculars. That's when I saw it. At first, I wasn't even sure what I was looking at. Some large, dark shape moving between the trees. I focused the binoculars, and my heart just about jumped into my throat. It was a tall, broad-shouldered figure completely covered in dark brownish hair. It moved slowly, not like a lumbering bear, but almost gracefully, as if it knew exactly where to step. Its posture reminded me of a person, but so much bigger, and there was a kind of intelligence in how it stopped, scanned the area, and touched the branches. I actually held my breath, frozen in place. I remember my hands shaking so badly that I had to steady the binoculars against a tree trunk. I couldn't see the face clearly. It was too far and partially covered by branches, but I could see that it stood on two legs. The sheer size of it made my stomach twist. I had no idea what I was looking at, but I knew one thing. It wasn't supposed to be there. Or maybe I wasn't supposed to be there. Every instinct told me to keep quiet and not draw attention to myself. I didn't even dare to take a photo at that moment, afraid the sound of my phone's camera or any movement might alert it. After a few long minutes, it moved out of my line of sight, heading behind a rocky outcrop. That's when I finally exhaled. My head was racing with questions. What the hell was that thing? A bear with mange standing on two legs? Some guy in a suit? But no, it didn't look like a costume. The way the muscles moved under the hair looked too natural. I realized I had goosebumps, and not just from the cold. I waited a bit, crouched low, listening. The woods were still unnaturally silent. Eventually, I decided I had to head back. The idea of continuing forward and risking another encounter was making my heart pound. I turned around carefully, stepping over roots and trying not to make noise. But as I retraced my path, I kept looking over my shoulder, and every now and then I could have sworn I saw something move far behind me, like it was following me, but keeping a distance. My nerves were on edge. You know that feeling when you're sure someone's watching you from behind? I had that all the way down. At one point I heard a snap of a branch not far off. I froze and stood completely still. My chest felt tight. I strained my ears, trying to pick up any sound of steps or movement, but it was just silence again. I started walking faster, not running, but moving as quickly as I could without making too much noise. The problem was the underbrush and fallen branches were everywhere, so every few steps I'd make a slight crunch or crack. Each time I expected to hear something behind me, something coming closer. The fear was building, and that's when something really freaked me out. I found more of those weird, huge footprints, fresh ones. They crossed the trail I had just taken earlier. It was like it had circled around to get ahead of me. That's when my pulse went crazy. I didn't know if it was trying to corner me or just messing with me. I didn't stick around to find out. I veered off my original route and took a steeper, more difficult path I knew would eventually lead back toward a lower elevation and a small creek I recognized. It was tough going, and I slipped a couple times on loose stones, skinning my palm and knees. The pain helped focus me, but fear kept flaring up every time I heard something that didn't sound like my own movement. When I finally reached a familiar spot, the edge of a clearing I'd passed on my way in, I took another look behind me. Nothing there, no visible shapes. Still, I had that uneasy sense of being observed. I didn't relax. In fact, I didn't stop for a drink of water or anything until I was back near my truck. I remember my hands shaking as I fumbled for my keys, scanning the tree line. Nothing moved. Nothing followed me out into the open field where I'd parked. I drove home in a daze. My heart was still pounding, and I was sweating despite the chill I'd felt up there. Once inside my house, I locked the door and stared at my phone, flipping through the few pictures I'd taken before the encounter got too intense. None of them showed the creature, only those weird footprints and some twisted branches. I felt this heavy dread, realizing I had no solid proof. Just these vague prints and my own memory. I tried to tell a couple of close friends about it later, but I could see in their eyes they didn't believe me. They smiled politely, maybe thought I imagined it, or assumed I'd seen a bear from a weird angle. I stopped talking about it after that. The fear I felt that day wasn't something I could easily explain anyway. People say if you run into something like that, a Bigfoot or whatever it was, you might be lucky. Some think it's a spiritual sign or a rare natural wonder. But what I felt out there wasn't wonder. It was primal fear, confusion, and this unsettling feeling that I'd walked into something's territory without permission. I'm still not sure what I saw. I just know it was real. It didn't feel like some forest illusion or a trick of the light. And there was this intelligence about it, something behind the eyes I never got a good look at. It felt old and aware, like it knew exactly how to scare me and then vanish before I could wrap my head around it. I haven't gone back to that area since. Sometimes I think about trying, armed with better camera equipment, or maybe going with a friend. But then I remember how it felt. The silence, the strange tracks, the bent trees, and that massive figure. That oppressive fear sticks with me. It wasn't just that I was startled by a large animal. It was that I understood, for one unsettling afternoon, that I was outmatched in every way. Whatever it was at home out there, and I was just an intruder. That day ended like it began, quietly. After I got home and calmed down, there was no big sign, no banging on my windows, no strange howls at night. It just stopped, like it had delivered its message, stay out, and so I have. Even now, when I close my eyes and recall that massive shape sliding between the trees, I get chills. It still doesn't make sense to me. Nothing's changed in Garfield. The townspeople go about their day, clueless that just a short drive away, something out there might be watching. I've got no real answer for what happened or what I saw. I only know it happened, and it shook me to my core. It's something I still can't explain and probably never will. Story 16. I'm not the type of person who usually shares stories like this, and I know how crazy it might sound. But after what happened to me in late 2023 near Delrose, New Hampshire, I can't keep it bottled up anymore. The whole thing still rattles me when I think about it. I work at a small sawmill outside of town. My life is pretty routine. I start early, end late, grab a beer with a couple of guys now and then, and head home along the same quiet road, bordered by thick patches of forest. It's not exciting, but it's calm, and I've always liked that. I've never been someone drawn to weird stories or local legends, but there's something about the woods around Delrose. If you grow up here, you hear talk. You dismiss it. You laugh it off. I always did. Just a few days before that night, I noticed a shoe hanging way up in a tree along the old back road I take home. It wasn't a big deal at first, just strange, like someone threw it up there as a prank. And there was this weird smell in the air. It reminded me of damp soil and something else I couldn't identify, almost like animal fur that hadn't been cleaned for months. It was earthy, musty, and strong enough that it stuck with me the whole walk. I tried to forget about it, but I couldn't shake how off it felt. A few nights later, I mentioned it to the guys at the bar, and one of them joked about Bigfoot sightings. Everyone laughed, including me, but inside I was uneasy. I don't believe in that stuff, at least I didn't. Still, the memory of that shoe and that smell kept nagging at me. I'm not sure what got into me that night, but I couldn't sleep. I had this restless feeling, like something was itching under my skin. The idea that maybe I'd missed something obvious wouldn't leave me alone. I decided, stupidly I guess, to head out there again. It was late, maybe around midnight. The moonlight was weak, but enough to make out shapes if I stood still long enough. I didn't tell anyone I was going. I just slipped on a jacket, grabbed a flashlight, and walked out. The wind was light, and I could hear my own footsteps crunching softly on the loose gravel and dried leaves. Everything was oddly quiet, like the woods were holding their breath. When I reached the spot where I'd seen that shoe, the first thing I noticed was the smell. It was there again, even stronger this time, earthy, musky, and almost rotten. My skin prickled. There was the shoe still dangling from that high branch. It looked totally out of place. For a second, I thought about climbing the tree to get a closer look, but something about that idea felt wrong. I settled for shining my flashlight around. The light caught the rough bark, a few twisted shrubs, and clumps of grass. Nothing special. But then I heard something behind me, like a low, muffled exhale. I whipped around, flashlight jerking side to side. I saw nothing at first, just dark shapes of trees and shrubs. My heart was thumping so hard I could feel it in my throat. I tried to calm down, telling myself it was just a deer or maybe the wind pushing through the branches. But that smell, that goddamn smell. It was heavier now, as if something stood closer than before. I felt like I was being watched. I took a few careful steps forward, scanning the tree line. The beam of my flashlight slid over a shape that shouldn't have been there. At first, I thought it was just a thick trunk, but it moved, slowly, like it was breathing. It was tall, taller than any person I've ever seen, maybe close to 8 feet. It had this broad body covered in what looked like dark, matted hair. I froze. I couldn't see its face clearly, but I knew it was looking at me. I swear I could feel its eyes, even though I couldn't pick out any details. My instinct screamed at me to run, but my legs felt anchored to the ground. I tried to control my breathing, to not make any sudden moves. The creature didn't charge. It didn't growl. It just stood there, partially hidden by a cluster of trees, as if deciding what to do. My mind raced. What the hell is this? A bear on 2 legs. Some kind of sick prank. But no human could fake that size and that shape. The silence made my ears ring. After what felt like forever, maybe it was just seconds, I'm not sure, it leaned back slightly, like it was pulling away. I remember the faint rustling as it moved, effortlessly quiet for something that size. My flashlight beam shook in my hand. The thing started to step backward into the darkness. No sudden move, no aggression, just retreating. And I just stood there, too shocked to speak or do anything. I wanted to ask something, shout, try to make sense of it, but I couldn't even open my mouth. In another moment it was gone, swallowed up by the black shadows of the forest. The smell lingered, but even that began to fade as I stood there, rooted to the spot, still not sure if I should run back home or stay and try to see it again. Eventually, the wind picked up a little, rustling leaves and snapping me back to my senses. My heart was still pounding like a drum, and my hands were so sweaty I almost dropped the flashlight. I did what anyone in that situation would do. I backed away, keeping my eyes on the trees, afraid that at any second it would reappear. I didn't hear any more sounds, no footsteps or branches breaking, nothing to signal it was still there. But the forest felt charged, like the air right before a heavy storm. Every hair on my arm stood on end. After I got some distance, I turned and practically speed-walked all the way home. I forced myself not to run because I was terrified that the moment I bolted, it would chase me. When I finally got inside, I locked the door, drew the blinds, and just stood there in the dim light of my living room, trying to slow my breathing. I remember leaning against the wall, sweating, cold and stunned. I didn't sleep that night. I kept replaying the encounter in my mind. There had been no roar, no violent display. It just stood there, watched me, and then backed away. The shock of seeing something like that, something I've always dismissed as myth or nonsense, messed with my head. I'm still shaken up by it. I have no proof. I didn't think to take a picture. My phone was in my pocket, but even if I'd tried, my hands were shaking so badly I would have ended up with a blurry mess. Plus, it all happened so fast. I've told only one close friend about it, someone I know won't mock me or spread the story around town. He listened and didn't laugh, but I could tell he didn't know what to believe. Honestly, I'm not sure what I believe. I know what I saw, or at least I know I saw something that doesn't fit into any normal category of animal I'm familiar with. I can still smell that musty stink when I think about it too hard. Ever since that night, I approach the woods differently. I don't talk about Bigfoot sightings or anything like that with people. I'm no expert. I don't have a clue what's living out there, and I'm not planning on going looking for it again. Whatever it was, it's real. It's out there. And for some reason, it let me see it, then slipped away without a sound. There's no big ending to this. I didn't discover evidence. I didn't become some crusader trying to prove the existence of this creature. Life went on. I still go to work, still grab a beer now and then, still take that old road, though I do so with a lot more caution. I haven't smelled that odor again. I haven't seen the shoe in the tree since. I guess it either fell down or someone took it. The memory of that night just sits in my head, as vivid and bizarre as it was when it happened. I can't explain it. I'm not here to convince anyone. I just needed to get it off my chest. That's all. It happened, and then it stopped, leaving me with more questions than answers. It's been months now, and I still have no explanation. Maybe I never will. Story 17. I remember that morning in a way I wish I could forget. It was still dark when I left my small cabin behind the ranger station. I'd been hearing these strange rumors for a couple of weeks, visitors whispering about huge silhouettes in the trees, weird sounds late at night. I'm not the kind of person who jumps at ghost stories, and I've been out in these woods more times than I can count. If there's something here, I should have come across it by now. But something about these reports got under my skin. Maybe it was the tension in people's voices, maybe just boredom on my part, but I decided to see for myself. I wasn't expecting anything truly bizarre. I mean, come on, it's 2024, not some old frontier tale, but I can still feel the cold knot in my stomach when I think back on what I saw. That day, I headed out earlier than usual. Barely any light had touched the horizon, but I needed the cover of dawn. Timberfield is a quiet rural community in Wyoming, mostly known for peaceful trails and the occasional moose sighting, not giant hairy creatures lurking in the woods. The silence was so complete I could hear my boots press into the damp earth. The smell of pine needles and moss hung in the air, and the only sounds were distant birds waking up. Nothing seemed out of place at first. I walked along an old, less-used trail, one that doesn't get many hikers, especially not this time of year. My flashlight beam bounced off trunks and brush, and for a long while it felt ordinary, like hundreds of other patrols I've done. Then I noticed something strange. Branches snapped and arranged in odd patterns. I've seen natural windfall, animal scratch marks, all sorts of signs in the forest, but this looked different. Thick branches had been twisted and placed in a crude arch over a section of the trail. It wasn't random storm damage. It felt intentional. I ran my gloved hand along one of them and found long strands of dark hair snagged in the bark. My pulse kicked up a notch. I crouched down and saw prints in the moist ground. These weren't normal footprints, too large to be a human, too wide and deep. It reminded me of those plaster casts some people claim are Bigfoot tracks, the ones I always rolled my eyes at. I'm telling you, seeing them in person, in my own patrol area, made every hair on my neck stand up. I stood there, heart thudding in my chest, scanning the forest. The early morning light filtered through the pines, and I realized how quiet it had become. No birds, no squirrels rustling. Just a thick silence. I don't know why, but I switched off my flashlight, as if not wanting to draw attention. That's when I heard it. A low, heavy, crunching sound, like something stepping carefully through dead leaves. It was behind me to the left, maybe 15, 20 yards away. I froze. I didn't even dare turn fully around. Instead, I slowly leaned forward, peeking around a fallen log. And that's when I saw it. There was a figure, massive and dark, standing partly hidden behind a cluster of trees. I can't say exactly how tall, but it easily dwarfed the underbrush. It was covered in dark, shaggy hair, and its shoulders were so broad it almost didn't seem real. It had a kind of hunched posture, not quite upright like a human, but not on all fours either. My heart was pounding so hard I was sure it could hear me. I tried to slow my breathing, pressing myself against the damp log. I kept thinking, this can't be happening. I must be imagining this. The creature moved its head slowly, as if sniffing the air. I remember the strange, heavy scent. It was like damp fur and earth, but sharper, more pungent. something I've never smelled before. It didn't just stand there either. It took a few careful steps, each one deliberate, barely making a sound despite its size. That's what freaked me out the most. Something so big moving with almost perfect silence. I clutched at a small branch just to have something in my hands. I felt sweat forming under my jacket, even though the morning air was cool. I watched as it leaned down to inspect something on the forest floor. Maybe it was looking at the same tracks I was looking at moments before. Its arm reached out. The arm was long, muscular under the fur, with fingers that ended in what looked like blunt nails. I couldn't see its face fully, just the outline of a heavy brow, a hint of deep-set eyes. It never growled or roared, but the tension in the air was suffocating. I kept thinking about the stories. People claiming to see a Bigfoot vanish into the woods, the skeptics laughing it off. If I told anyone about this, how would I even describe it without sounding crazy? Then there was a moment I'll never forget. The creature paused and turned its head slightly in my direction. I don't know if it saw me or just sensed my presence. I didn't move a muscle. I just stared through the gaps in the foliage, barely daring to blink. Its posture changed, like it was listening. I could almost feel its breathing from where I was hidden. That's when I noticed my legs were trembling. The fear wasn't just a thought. It was physical, an ice-cold wave washing over me. After what felt like an eternity, it straightened up, scanned the area, and then moved off deeper into the woods. It didn't run. It slipped away, stepping behind a large pine and vanishing like a ghost. The silence remained for several minutes after it left, and I couldn't bring myself to stand up right away. I just stayed there, crouched, breathing through my mouth to avoid making noise. When I finally did stand, my knees felt weak. I hesitated before following its path. I mean, who in their right mind would? I'd seen enough. I took a different route back to the ranger station, moving as quietly as possible, constantly looking over my shoulder. Every broken twig made my heart skip a beat. I half expected it to be trailing me, but I never saw it again that day. By the time I reached the station, the sun was up, and everything seemed normal again. The familiar vehicles, the smell of coffee from the break room, the distant hum of morning chores. None of it matched what I'd just experienced. I tried to write down some notes, just what I saw and where. I didn't want to come off as some lunatic, so I kept it factual. Large footprints, strange branch formations, possible unknown animal sighting. My supervisors read it and gave me careful looks. They didn't call me crazy. They just nodded and thanked me, said they'd keep it in mind and asked me not to mention it around visitors. I knew right then they didn't know what to do with the information. And honestly, I understood. How do you handle something like that? The rest of the day passed in a fog. I went about my usual tasks, checking the trails, helping a family pick a safe route for a short hike, reminding a couple of teenagers to stay on marked paths. The whole time, I kept replaying that scene in my head. The giant figure, its careful steps, the way it seemed to sense me. There's no easy explanation. A guy in a suit. No one would be crazy enough to pull that stunt this deep in the woods. A bear. I know what bears look like. This was no bear. Something else. Something we're not supposed to see. Even now, as I try to put these words together, my hands are shaking slightly. I've spent years out here, and I've never felt unsafe. The forest was always a place I knew well. Now I realize there are corners I don't understand, creatures that might share this land but rarely show themselves. Did I stumble into its territory by accident? Did it let me see it on purpose? I can't say. The weirdest part is how it just ended. One moment I'm staring at something that shouldn't exist, and a few hours later I'm back to my normal routine, as if nothing happened. Except I can't forget it. I can't shake the memory of those massive footprints, that heavy silence, that presence in the trees. I don't know what I saw. I don't know if I'll ever see it again. All I know is that day changed something in me. I'm aware now that this world holds secrets that don't care if we believe in them or not. I still do my patrols and try to act normal, but I find myself listening more closely at dusk, looking for shapes between the pines. And whenever I pass that old, half-forgotten trail, I feel a twist in my gut, because I know what happened, and I know I can't fully explain it. It's just there, part of my memory and part of this place, and I have no idea if it's watching me again. Silent, hidden, and impossible to understand. Story 18. I remember it happened in late summer 2025. I'd been living in Kenwood, Idaho for a few years by then, and one of my favorite habits was taking these long walks near the edge of the woods, right where the dense pines and firs started to get thicker. Normally, those walks felt comforting. I'd go out after lunch, the air still warm but mellow, and I'd listen to the birds, watch the squirrels, maybe spot a deer if I got lucky. It usually felt like stepping into another world for a couple of hours, a peaceful one. But on that particular afternoon, something was different. The air felt strangely heavy, and it's hard to describe, but I had this odd sense that I wasn't supposed to be there. I know it sounds silly. These were paths I'd walked dozens of times. Yet, as soon as I crossed into the more wooded area, I noticed how the leaves rustled in a way that almost sounded like whispers. Not the usual crisp sound of leaves swaying in a breeze, but something softer, more intentional. And the smell in the air was off too. A kind of damp, earthy smell that made me think of old mossy logs, but stronger, more pungent. It made my stomach tighten a bit. I tried to brush it off. I kept walking, sticking to a less marked trail I'd found a while back. I don't know why I chose that path. Maybe I just wanted some solitude. The forest felt different that day, but I was curious, not frightened yet. I kept going, stepping quietly over roots and loose rocks. At some point, I realized the birds had stopped singing. Not gradually faded, just stopped. It was like the entire forest had taken a deep, silent breath. I'm not some big outdoorsman, but I know these woods well enough. Silence like that isn't normal. Birds and small animals make noise all day long, unless something scares them. I paused, listening, and heard this faint rustling, like something big shifting its weight behind a thicket. My heart kicked up a notch, but I told myself it was probably a deer or maybe a black bear. Still, that silence, it made my skin crawl. I noticed some shrubs and ferns ahead that looked crushed, as if something large had pushed through there recently. The branches weren't just bent, they were snapped clean off in places. I leaned in, squinting. It almost looked like a rough trail, but not made by humans. Too wide, too erratic. I knelt down to get a better look. As I did, I caught a movement out of the corner of my eye. I turned my head slowly, and about 30 feet away behind a cluster of pines, there was a shape. Large, dark, and still. At first, I thought it might be a huge bear standing upright. But the shape was all wrong. It was taller, more like a large man covered in thick brownish hair. It wasn't moving. I could see a vague outline of its shoulders and something like a head, partially hidden behind tree trunks. My mind raced. I've seen pictures people claim are Bigfoot, but I never gave them much thought. Yet there I was, staring at something I couldn't explain. My body went stiff. Every instinct told me not to run. I just froze, heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my ears. The creature was just standing there, or crouching, I couldn't tell. I tried to focus, but my vision was messing with me. The forest's dim light, the angle of the branches, it all made it hard to get a clear view. But I could see enough to know this wasn't a person in a suit. It was too solid, too real. Its arms were long, hanging lower than a human's would. Its hair was uneven, thicker in some places, almost like it was tangled with bits of forest debris. And the smell, it intensified. A damp, musky odor, like wet earth and unwashed animal fur, hit me in waves. We stared at each other. At least I assume it was looking at me. I couldn't see its eyes clearly, but I felt them on me. The tension was unlike anything I've felt before. It wasn't charging at me, it wasn't making noise, it was just watching. My thoughts were running wild. Should I speak, make noise, slowly back away? I was too terrified to do anything but stay still. My chest felt tight, my legs felt weak. I remember trying to swallow, and my mouth was so dry I nearly choked. The forest around us stayed silent, like every creature was waiting for what would happen next. After what felt like minutes, though it could have been just a handful of seconds, this creature made a slight movement. Not toward me, but backward. It kind of shifted its weight and stepped away, disappearing behind a thicker patch of trees and brush. I didn't hear any big footsteps or branches snapping, just a gentle rustle, and then nothing. I stood there, straining my ears, waiting for it to reappear. It didn't. The silence remained, pressing in on me. The air felt suffocating, like I was holding my breath underwater. I knew I had to leave. I wasn't about to chase whatever that thing was. So, I turned around carefully, one slow step at a time, trying not to trip or make noise. I kept expecting to see it again, to feel a hand on my shoulder or hear a snarl behind me. But nothing happened. By the time I reached a more familiar part of the forest path, I realized I was shaking. I had sweat dripping down the back of my neck, and I felt like I'd just escaped something dangerous, even though I hadn't been attacked. It's a weird feeling, like standing on the edge of a cliff and looking down, knowing you could fall at any second. When I finally got out of the woods and back onto the dirt road that leads toward Kenwood, my mind was racing. What had I seen? Something about it felt so deliberate, like it wanted me to see it. There was no mistake about its size or its presence. It was no illusion. I've heard stories about Bigfoot sightings, but I always dismissed them as made-up tales, bored people on the internet. Now I don't know what to think. I got home, and I didn't know how to bring it up. Eventually I told one relative, someone I trust not to laugh in my face. They seemed curious, but probably thought I misidentified a bear. I know a bear when I see one, and no bear looks like that. Still, it's hard to make others understand if they haven't been there, felt that heaviness, smelled that odor, seen how the animal life just vanished from that spot. It was like stepping into another reality for a few minutes. Later that evening, I tried to find anything about sightings in the Kenwood area. I dug through old records, random forum posts, and old stories passed around locally. I found vague mentions of a large man in the forest that older folks talked about once in a while. Nothing solid, just whispers and offhand comments. But reading them after what I experienced, I got chills. These weren't just tall tales. People had seen something they couldn't explain, something that blended into these woods better than any known animal. The weirdest part is, I never felt like it wanted to harm me. It was scary as hell, but it seemed more curious than aggressive. Still, knowing it's out there, that it can stand so close without making a sound, or leaving any real trace except for broken branches, makes the forest feel different now. I keep thinking about its presence, that moment of mutual observation. It's like it allowed me to see it on purpose, then vanished, leaving me with a lot of questions and no real answers. Since that day, I've kept walking the edges of the forest, but I'm more cautious. I pay more attention to sounds, smells, and how the animals behave. I haven't seen it again, and part of me is relieved. Another part of me, though, is still curious. It's hard not to feel that strange pull, like I got a peek behind the curtain of something we're not meant to fully understand. I don't want tourists or thrill seekers poking around. I just want to keep this to myself, share it anonymously here, hoping maybe someone else has had a similar experience. That day still gives me goosebumps when I think about it. I can't fully explain it, and I guess I never will. It just happened and ended as abruptly as it began. The forest around Kenwood feels deeper and darker now, as if holding secrets that stretch back generations. And I'm left with this lingering feeling that I stumbled into something bigger than me, something that watches, waits, and for reasons I can't guess, sometimes shows itself, then slips away without a sound. Story 19. I'm still trying to process what happened to me out there last week. I haven't really told many people, just one close friend, but I need to get it off my chest somehow, so I'm writing it down here. I know this might sound unbelievable. All I can say is that I'm not the kind of person who jumps to wild conclusions, and I'm certainly not looking for attention. But this experience rattled me in a way I still can't fully explain. It was early morning in Clearbrook back in 2026. The village is tiny, out in Oregon, and I'd been staying there for a short trip to just unwind, take pictures, and maybe capture some nice shots of the misty forests. I'm not a pro photographer, just a guy who likes to head out with a camera and see what comes up. That morning, a heavy fog blanketed everything, creating this pale, quiet atmosphere. It was the kind of silence that makes your ears ring. I don't know if you've ever experienced that, where it's so quiet you start to feel tense, like you're waiting for something to break that silence. So I set out before the sun was fully up, camera hanging from my neck, and wandered off the main trail, figuring I'd try to find a new angle or something no one else bothers to photograph. Clearbrook isn't exactly touristy, so it's easy to get lost in the woods without seeing another soul. With the thick fog, the trees looked distorted and twisted, their branches reaching out like skeletal arms. I remember stepping carefully because the ground was uneven and tangled with exposed roots. I didn't want to break an ankle way out there. At some point I realized I hadn't heard a single bird or even a squirrel since I set foot off the trail. Nothing but the soft crunch of damp leaves under my boots. The silence was unnerving. Usually you hear a faint rustle, a distant chirp, something. But that morning, it was as if the forest was holding its breath. I paused under a big oak that was all gnarled and mossy, trying to line up a shot of these diffuse tree silhouettes against the mist, when something moved in the corner of my viewfinder. At first I thought maybe I'd just caught my own reflection in the lens or something, but I adjusted the zoom, aiming at a patch of grayish-green foliage a bit ahead. Through the fog, I saw it. This tall, broad shape moving slowly between the trunks. It was covered in what looked like dark, matted hair or fur. Not a deer, not a bear, not anything I recognized. It was upright, definitely walking on two legs, and it had this strange heaviness to it. My heart started racing, and I'm pretty sure I stopped breathing for a moment. I've heard stories, of course. People mention Bigfoot around these parts like some old legend or joke. I never took that stuff seriously. But seeing that figure in that thick fog, I couldn't help thinking about those stories. My hands started shaking, and I was afraid I'd drop my camera. I tried to steady it, to at least snap a photo. I managed to take a few shots. Click, click, but I could feel my fingers trembling. The lens kept fogging slightly from my breath. Everything felt unreal, like my brain was trying to shut down the fear by telling me this was some trick of the light. Then it stopped moving. It turned its head, at least I think it did, and seemed to look directly at me. Even through that haze, I felt something like eye contact. I can't describe it well. It was like a pressure in my chest, that tense feeling when you know something big and unpredictable is focused on you. I was half convinced I was done for, that it would charge or lunge or do something terrifying. But it just stood there, staring. I didn't know what to do. I lowered my camera, trying not to seem threatening. I remember holding my breath, as if even the sound of inhaling might set it off. My heart was pounding so loud I was sure it could hear me. The damp scent of moss and earth was all around, and I swear I could smell a faint, musty odor coming from where it was standing. Not just the woods, something else, almost like wet fur. After what felt like a lifetime but was probably less than a minute, it moved again. It tilted its head slightly as if curious, then stepped back, disappearing into that shifting white fog. It was so smooth, so quiet, that if I hadn't been staring right at it, I would have thought I imagined the whole thing. The minute it was gone, I felt my legs weaken. I actually leaned against a tree to keep from toppling over. I listened hard, trying to hear branches snapping or leaves rustling, but nothing came. The silence returned, swallowing every hint that something had just been there. I didn't know if I should follow. Part of me wanted to, just to confirm I wasn't seeing things. But another part of me was terrified. I know how stupid that sounds, a grown man scared in the woods, but trust me, you'd be scared too if you'd stood face to face with something so off. It was taller than any man I've met, bulkier too, and there was just an energy to it, something primal and unsettling. I decided not to chase after it. I felt like I'd be invading something's space, like I wasn't meant to be there in the first place. I waited a few minutes, trying to calm down, then looked at my camera's viewfinder. The shots I took were all shaky and blurred. The figure was there, but in such a distorted, smudged form, it might as well have been a tree trunk for anyone else looking at the image. I couldn't believe I hadn't gotten something clearer. But my hands had been trembling so much, and the fog was so dense, that the photos were basically useless. Still, I knew what I saw. When I finally headed back to Clearbrook, everything felt surreal. The short walk out of the woods seemed to take forever. I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see the creature following me. But there was no one, just the muffled sound of distant water dripping off leaves and my own breathing. By the time I got back to my place, the village was coming to life. People going about their routines, completely unaware of what had just happened not too far away. I told a friend later that afternoon, someone I trust not to mock me. We both ended up sitting quietly, neither of us sure what to make of it. He didn't doubt me exactly, but we agreed it's not something you go announcing to the whole town. We knew how it would sound, some crazy story of "I saw Bigfoot." Without any clear evidence, it would just become a joke. And anyway, a part of me felt protective of that creature. I didn't want a bunch of people charging into those woods looking for it. It didn't hurt me. It just appeared, acknowledged my existence, and vanished. Even now, I can't shake the feeling that I experienced something that doesn't fit into our normal understanding of the world. It was just one odd morning, one strange encounter in the fog, and it ended as quietly as it began. There were no dramatic chases, no roaring or screaming, no horror movie theatrics. Just silence, tension, fear, curiosity, and then emptiness. One moment it was there, the next it wasn't. I still think about it when I look at those blurry photos. There's nothing conclusive, nothing I can point at and say, "See? Proof." But I know what I saw. I don't pretend to understand it, and I don't think I ever will. I just know that the morning fog that day concealed something real and large and unsettling, something that sent a chill down my spine that I'll remember as long as I live. Since then, I've walked the edges of that forest a few times, but I never went back in that deep. I'm not sure if I'm scared it will be there or scared it won't be. Either way, I haven't seen it again. Life in Clearbrook went on as usual. It's like the whole encounter was just a hiccup in my reality, something that blinked into existence, showed itself, and then vanished, leaving me with more questions than answers. I guess that's how these things go. Sometimes you cross paths with something unexplainable, and it doesn't give you a second chance to understand it. I'm still on edge about the whole thing. Even writing this out makes my heart beat a little faster, remembering the moment it stared at me through the fog. The forest is still out there, the trees still sway in the wind, and that creature, whatever it is, might be walking between them right now. I can't explain it, and I'm done trying. It happened, and then it stopped, and that's all there is to it. Story 20. I remember that day so clearly. It was the summer of 2027, a few months after I'd moved to Bearfield, Washington. I'd settled into this quiet little town, working as a stocker in the local market. My shifts were dull, straightforward, lining up cans, rotating produce, making sure everything looked good for the handful of regulars who came in. By the time I got a day off, I was always itching to step away from the shelves and just breathe some fresh air. Out here, the forests are never too far. A short drive, a small trail, and you're completely surrounded by these tall pines that seem to stretch forever, muffling the world with their thick needles. It felt like the best way to clear my mind. On that particular afternoon, the sun was strong but not scorching. The air smelled like pine and moss, and the ground was soft and springy under my boots. I'd chosen a less traveled path this time. Maybe I was just curious. I'd heard from a few locals that if you veered off the main track, you could find this natural overlook where you'd see the entire valley. I had no map, just a vague idea of where to go, figuring I'd follow my gut and the general slope of the land. At first, everything was normal. A few birds chirping in the branches above, the occasional squirrel scurrying off as soon as it sensed me. But after about an hour, I started noticing strange things. The forest floor isn't usually something I pay too much attention to beyond looking for roots that might trip me, but this time something was off. Some branches I saw along the trail were bent at weird angles, not just broken, but twisted and set in a pattern. It's hard to explain, but they looked deliberately arranged. There were these impressions in the dirt, too, like footprints, but spread too far apart and definitely too wide for a regular person. I remember crouching down to get a closer look at one. If I spread my hand as wide as I could, my handprint was still nowhere near as large. It struck me as odd, but I wasn't thinking monsters or anything like that. Maybe a bear, but I'd never seen bear tracks look quite like that. Still, I shrugged it off. The place was remote enough that maybe big animals got comfortable wandering through. As I continued, I noticed the silence. The deeper I went, the quieter it got. I could still hear faint sounds, a distant creak rushing somewhere downhill and some gentle rustling of leaves high above. But there were fewer birds. I felt that subtle shift that I've heard other hikers talk about, like something large was near, and everything else had gone still, keeping its head down. I kept walking, carefully, feeling a knot tighten in my stomach. Then I saw it. Or at least I think I did. It happened so fast, and yet the image is burned into my mind. I was moving between a cluster of thick pines when I spotted something tall and dark move between the trunks ahead. I stopped dead in my tracks. At first I thought it was a person, maybe a hunter wearing something dark. But the shape was off. Broad shoulders, a head that seemed to merge into the torso without much of a neck. The figure had a sort of dark, reddish-brown hair covering it. It stood there for just a second, half concealed by the trees, not advancing, not retreating, just looking. My heart started pounding. I felt that hot flush in my face that comes with pure adrenaline. I've seen bears, and I know how they move. Heavy, but still somehow graceful. This was different. It was tall, taller than me, and I'm not short. It looked strong, built in a way that suggested it could tear a branch apart without trying. My mind was screaming at me, but I stayed still, gripping a nearby sapling for balance. I figured if I ran, it might chase me. If I approached, I might provoke it. So I just stared, trying to keep my breathing quiet and steady. I didn't see teeth or facial details from where I stood, just a broad, shadowy outline. But I had the overwhelming feeling it was staring right back. I can't even describe the intensity of that moment. No sound, no words, just this strange electric tension between us. I wanted to call out, to say something stupid like, "Hello," as if that would clear up this bizarre situation. But I stayed silent. Something about its presence felt not exactly hostile, but definitely unsettling, like it was measuring me, figuring out what I was. Then, slowly, it turned. I didn't hear heavy footsteps. I just saw it sort of glide behind a tree, and then another, and then it was gone. Just like that. No grunt, no roar, no breaking branches. It disappeared as silently as it had appeared. I stood there, paralyzed, for what felt like minutes. My ears were straining to pick up any sound, breathing, crackling twigs. But I got nothing. Eventually, I mustered the courage to approach the spot where I'd seen it. I found a few more of those strange footprints in the soft mulch, so large and oddly shaped. Some broken branches were arranged in what looked like a makeshift barrier or marker. I can't say for sure what it all meant, but it definitely wasn't random. I felt like I'd just intruded on something's space, something bigger, smarter, and more mysterious than I'd ever considered could be out here. My instincts kicked in. I turned back the way I'd come, trying to keep my pace calm and steady, but every step felt like I was walking on eggshells. I checked behind me constantly, expecting to see it peering around a tree. The forest didn't return to normal right away. The quiet remained, a heavy silence that pressed on me. It made me realize that maybe I wasn't at the top of the food chain here. Maybe I was being watched still, even though I couldn't see anything. The walk back felt longer than before. At some point, I started to hear distant bird calls again, which eased my nerves a bit. By the time I reached my car, I was sweating and shaking slightly. I sat in the driver's seat, staring at my own pale reflection in the rearview mirror, trying to process what I'd just witnessed. This wasn't a dog, or a bear, or some prankster in a costume. Everything about it felt too real, too raw. My gut told me that I'd seen something people talk about only in hushed tones, something like the stories you read online and dismiss as nonsense. But this had just happened. To me. I debated telling someone, maybe a co-worker at the store. But the second I imagined their faces, I knew how it'd sound. It'd be a joke, or worse, they'd think I was losing it. Bearfield is quiet, normal, the kind of place where nobody expects anything like this. I decided to keep it to myself. But that night, lying in bed, I kept replaying that moment. The way it stood so still, the way its silhouette looked in the filtered sunlight, the way it seemed curious yet cautious. Whatever it was real, and it probably had been there long before I came stumbling through its territory. I've gone over that day in my head 100 times now, and nothing about it makes more sense than it did then. I never found that overlook I was searching for, and I sure as hell haven't gone back to that spot since. When I'm in the store, stacking cans or chatting with a customer, I'll sometimes drift off and remember the quiet of that forest, the bent branches, and those massive footprints. It still gives me chills. I keep wondering if it's still out there, watching quietly, waiting for another curious hiker to wander too far off the beaten path. Even now, I don't know what I really encountered. Maybe I never will. It happened suddenly and ended just as quickly. There was no follow-up, no grand finale. Just that brief, unnerving standoff, and then silence. I guess some things out there don't need explanation. They just are. And maybe that's scarier than any story I could make up. It's something I'll never be able to shake off, and I'm not sure I even want to.